Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the stone corridors of a medieval convent. You can almost hear the echo of sandals on flagstones, smell the faint mixture of beeswax, old wood, and the must of parchment. The nuns are already awake, long before the sun has considered rising. Their bells drag them out of sleep into prayer, and prayer fills nearly every waking moment after that. It sounds peaceful, right? But here's the first reality check. You probably won't survive this life. Most of us today wouldn't last a week in the rigid silence, the bitter cold, the hunger that comes with a cloistered medieval existence. And if you're imagining freedom or spiritual ecstasy, think again. For many women, entering a convent was less about divine calling and more about family strategy, economic necessity, or lack of other choices. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to hear from you. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see this little global community gathered together across so many time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in the 12th century, a period when convents were springing up across Europe, especially in places like England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Monastic orders multiplied, each with their own interpretations of how best to serve God. For women, the Benedictine tradition was one of the most established. St. Benedict's rule shaped nearly every aspect of life: when to rise, when to pray, when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. It was a framework for total order, meant to keep the soul focused on God by removing distractions. But let's strip away the romantic veneer. Imagine the physical world, the convent wasn't some pristine holy palace. It was stone walls without central heating, narrow windows that let in drafts but not much light, and roofs that leaked unless repaired constantly. Bedding was often straw-filled sacks. Blankets were coarse wool. Winter nights were bone-chilling, with frost creeping over the edges of wooden chests, and water freezing in jugs kept near the bed. The bell ruled all. You might think an alarm clock is annoying. Try being jolted awake at matins, often scheduled around 2 or 3 a.m. The entire convent would shuffle into the chapel, some half asleep, chanting the Psalms in Latin. Few nuns actually understood every word, since Latin fluency wasn't guaranteed even among literate women, but repetition was the point. Chanting became muscle memory, a steady hum through the night. After matins came lauds, the morning prayer, timed with the break of dawn. Then there were prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. 7 hours of prayer across the day, each ringing with bells. Daily life was chopped into holy fragments, and personal choice almost vanished. Now you might wonder, what did nuns actually do in between prayers? A lot of their time was taken up with manual labor. Benedict's rule was clear. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. So women were expected to work with their hands, in kitchens, gardens, fields, and workshops. If the convent had land, the nuns farmed it, sowing rye, barley, beans, and peas, tending orchards, and keeping bees for honey and wax. They spun wool, wove cloth, and sewed their own rough habits. Needlework wasn't just functional. Many convents became known for producing exquisite embroidered altar cloths and vestments that ended up in cathedrals. But here's a dull, important detail. Convents were economic units. Families donated land, money, or goods when a daughter entered, effectively treating her as a financial transaction. Wealthy convents could sustain themselves with rents from tenant farmers, while poorer houses struggled, their nuns forced to barter or rely on alms. Survival wasn't guaranteed, especially in harsh winters or during famines. Food itself was plain, repetitive, and meager. Meat was forbidden for most orders, except fish. Meals consisted of bread, pottage, a watery stew of grains and vegetables, and maybe cheese or eggs if the convent had animals. The diet was designed to humble the body, not please the palate. Hunger was a form of discipline, reminding the nun of her dependence on God. Yet malnutrition was common, and illnesses spread easily in such closed communities. We also can't forget silence. The rule enforced strict limits on speech. Conversations were restricted to specific places and times. Instead, nuns often used hand signs to communicate. Silence wasn't about peace of mind, it was about obedience. Words could spark gossip, conflict, or distraction, so they were cut off at the root. You, as a nun, lived inside your head, repeating prayers, working quietly, or meditating on scripture. And here's another layer of reality. Not every woman inside those stone walls wanted to be there. Families sometimes sent daughters to convents because they couldn't afford dowries for marriage. A girl as young as 7 could be given to the convent as an oblate, raised within the cloister without her consent. Others joined because of scandal. An illegitimate child, for example, could find a safer life hidden behind convent walls. Still, convents weren't prisons, at least not in every sense. Some nuns became scholars, copying manuscripts in scriptoria, preserving text through careful labor with ink and quill. Women like Hildegard of Bingen gained reputations as writers, mystics, and even advisors to powerful men. But those were exceptions. The average nun wasn't writing theological treatises. She was scrubbing, planting, spinning, or mending, her work disappearing into the endless cycle of daily need. We also need to picture the rhythms of the year. Medieval timekeeping wasn't digital or precise. It followed the sun and the seasons. In summer, the hours stretched longer. In winter, darkness came quickly. Festivals like Easter or Christmas punctuated the monotony with slightly better food and music. Lent meant stricter fasting, sometimes down to 1 meal a day. Everything, labor, prayer, food, was seasonal, tied to the natural cycles of harvest and scarcity. Even illness followed a seasonal pattern. Winter meant coughs, fevers, and frostbite. Summer brought fevers from spoiled water or infection from wounds earned in manual labor. There was no convent infirmary as we'd imagine today, just simple herbal remedies, sometimes effective, often not. A cough could turn into pneumonia, a scratch from tending animals could fester. Death was ever present, and burials were quiet, often within the convent grounds themselves. For the listener today, it's easy to imagine the convent as a safe refuge from the chaos of medieval wars or politics. And yes, walls and rules offered a kind of protection. But safety was relative. Convents were sometimes raided, their goods plundered. Armies passing through could strip resources bare. Political tides also intruded. Kings and bishops had authority over these religious houses, and a shift in favor or funding could make or break a convent's survival. Now pause and imagine yourself there. The daily grind has worn away at your sense of individuality. You rise before dawn, chant the psalms until your voice is hoarse, labor with your hands until they ache, eat a thin broth that never fills you, then return to the chapel again and again. The silence is crushing. The chill never leaves your bones. You live decades this way, waiting for heaven, while the world outside shifts, crusades, markets, kings, and wars passing you by. And yet, the convent was also one of the few spaces where medieval women could hold authority. An abbess might control vast lands, negotiate with bishops, and command dozens of sisters. She was a figure of real influence, though her power was framed within obedience to the church. Nuns, too, had literacy at a time when most women and many men did not. To read scripture was a privilege, even if it was couched in endless repetition. But here's the tension. How much of this life was chosen, and how much was imposed? Did women find peace in the rhythm or only resignation? Did the silence bring them closer to God, or merely trap them in their own minds? The bell rings again in your imagination. Another prayer begins. The same Latin words, the same stone walls, the same cold air. Tomorrow will be no different. nor the day after that. And so, as we leave this first glimpse of convent life, I want to leave you with a question. If you had been born into medieval Europe as a woman with limited choices, would you have seen the convent as salvation, or as a lifelong sentence? The bell rings and the pattern continues. Hours blur into one another, prayers rise and fall, and the sense of time becomes slippery inside the convent. For us today, it's difficult to imagine living on such a narrow track of routine. Every day resembled the last, until the sameness itself became a form of discipline. Yet hidden beneath that rhythm were tensions, tiny variations, and practical necessities that shaped how medieval nuns actually survived. Let's begin with the strict timetable. The Benedictine rule, which many convents followed in one form or another, broke the day into prayer, reading, and labor. After rising for matins in the dead of night, the nuns returned briefly to their beds, or stayed in the chapel until dawn for lauds. Work followed, usually until terse mid-morning prayers. Then came a meal, taken in silence. After sext at noon, more labor or reading filled the hours until none, roughly mid-afternoon. Evening brought vespers, and after Compline, the community was expected to sleep in communal dormitories. The hours were designed to ensure there was never a stretch of time left idle. Yet reality never perfectly fit the rule. Weather, sickness, or the sheer need to survive often reshaped the ideal. If a harvest was late, nuns spent extra hours in the fields. If food was scarce, more energy went into finding or preserving what little was available. The bell might still call to prayer, but necessity sometimes forced flexibility, though officially the records always portrayed strict obedience. Now, consider economic reality. A convent was not simply a spiritual community, it was also a land-holding institution. Wealthier houses owned farmland, mills, or even fishing rights. Tenants working that land owed rent, either in money or in kind, grain, livestock, wool, or labor. The abbess managed these resources, often with the help of stewards. The nun depended on these revenues to survive, since donations alone rarely sustained a whole community. But not all convents had such wealth. Smaller, poorer houses struggled. A few acres of poor soil might yield enough grain for bread, but little more. When famine struck, like during the early 14th century, convents without strong financial backing found themselves begging or making painful cuts. Meals shrank to near starvation levels. Malnutrition hit the elderly and the sick first, but no one escaped the hunger. The diet itself deserves attention because it shows just how stripped down daily life was. Imagine sitting at a wooden table in the refectory, a long hall with benches running the length of it. A nun reads aloud from scripture while the others eat silently, their eyes lowered to wooden bowls. Bread was the staple, coarse and heavy. Pottage, that thick stew of grains and vegetables, appeared daily, sometimes flavored with onions, leeks, or herbs from the convent garden. On good days, there might be cheese or eggs. On feast days, fish or dried fruits could appear. Meat from four-footed animals was generally forbidden, except in the infirmary for the ill. The monotony itself was intentional. Food was meant to sustain, not delight. Over time, fasting and scarcity left visible marks. Many nuns' teeth wore down from coarse bread. Their bodies grew thin, especially in winter when vegetables ran low. Illness spread more easily in such weakened states, yet the rule celebrated this suffering. Hunger was not just unfortunate, but spiritually useful, keeping the body humble. Let's move now into the physical environment. Medieval convents were built in varying styles, but most had a similar layout. A chapel at the center, a cloistered walk around a courtyard, a refectory for eating, dormitories for sleeping, and workrooms or kitchens nearby. Gardens supplied vegetables and herbs, both culinary and medicinal. The walls enclosed the nuns from the outside world, a physical reminder of their separation from secular life. Inside those walls, silence dominated. Remember, conversations were limited and often banned outside specific spaces. Instead, nuns developed sign languages, a series of gestures to indicate common needs. Want salt at the table? A gesture for that? Need scissors in the workroom? Another sign. This silent communication kept the rule intact, though human nature found ways to stretch it. Marginal notes in manuscripts hint at whispered conversations, small rebellions against enforced quiet. After all, complete silence is nearly impossible when dozens of people live side by side. But the convent wasn't just about spiritual withdrawal. It was also a place of labor and production. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, brewing ale, and making candles were common tasks. Manuscript copying was important in some houses, though not all had scriptoria. Skilled embroidery became a hallmark of certain convents, with nuns producing richly decorated vestments for churches and bishops. The hours of patient stitching reflected devotion, but also provided valuable goods to exchange for money or favor. This labor wasn't optional. Work filled the hours between prayers. Benedict's rule explicitly tied manual labor to spiritual growth, reminding the sisters that labor was a way of following Christ. Even noble-born women, who might have entered the convent with fine clothes and family prestige, were expected to take up humble tasks. The community demanded equality in labor, at least in theory, though in practice some divisions remained. That leads us to status differences inside the convent. Not every nun lived the same life. Wealthy families often secured better treatment for their daughters. They might bring in generous dowries, which allowed them more privileges or lighter duties. Poorer women, or those without strong family backing, sometimes did the heaviest labor. There were also layers of membership. Not everyone was a fully professed nun. Some were lay sisters, who did the manual work and were less involved in liturgy. This created subtle hierarchies within the supposedly equal community. Now picture the changing seasons. Spring brought planting, the rhythm of turning soil, sowing seed, and tending livestock. Summer meant long days of labor, gathering herbs, repairing buildings, and preparing for harvest. Autumn was filled with intensity, as every hand was needed to gather grain, press apples, or preserve vegetables before the cold set in. Winter then imposed stillness, hunger, and illness. Fires were rationed, fuel was expensive. Long hours of darkness were broken by candles, which themselves were precious, made from beeswax or tallow. The convent calendar also turned on liturgical seasons. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, each imposed specific rhythms of fasting, prayer, and ritual. Festivals could be small breaks from monotony, with processions, decorated chapels, and music. Yet even joy was regulated. Every emotion, every bodily need was filtered through rules designed to keep the soul on track. But not all convent life was harmony and obedience. Communities of women, living together for decades, inevitably bred conflicts. Records of visitations, official inspections by bishops, reveal disputes. Some nuns complained of harsh abbesses. Others resisted rules, sneaking food or breaking silence. Gossip existed, even if forbidden. On rare occasions, scandals broke out. Accusations of inappropriate relationships, misuse of convent funds, or open defiance of discipline. These were exceptions, but they remind us that nuns were human, not perfect spiritual machines. Education varied as well. Some convents prized literacy, teaching nuns to read Latin scripture. Others only taught enough for prayers to be memorized, not fully understood. A few exceptional women, like Hildegard of Bingen, composed music, wrote theology, and corresponded with kings. But for the majority, education was functional and limited. Learning served the liturgy, not personal ambition. Still, convents could provide opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Women shut out from universities or guilds could still write, study, and even hold authority within these walls. The abbess in particular wielded unusual power for a medieval woman, overseeing land, tenants, and the spiritual lives of her sisters. She could negotiate with bishops, sometimes even with kings. For women from noble backgrounds, the abbacy was one of the few leadership roles possible outside marriage. Yet the price of this authority was steep. A woman who became abbess bore heavy responsibility. If the convent ran into debt, she was accountable. If the sisters broke discipline, she faced criticism from bishops. Her power was real, but always under scrutiny, and always vulnerable to outside interference from male authorities. Let's not forget outsiders. While the convent was enclosed, it was not isolated. Servants, tenants, visitors, and patrons came and went. Pilgrims sometimes stopped at convent guest houses. Local lords donated money or land, hoping for prayers in return. Bishops visited, sometimes with little notice, inspecting the convent's discipline. Each of these encounters reminded the nuns that they were part of a larger network of medieval society, not cut off from it entirely. Through all this, the daily grind continued. Prayer, labor, silence, hunger, obedience. The sameness pressed down on the senses, shaping the body and mind. It's easy to imagine a kind of numbness setting in, where the days blurred and years slipped by, measured only by the turning of the church calendar. But was this sameness suffocating or soothing? For some, perhaps it was imprisonment, stripping away individuality. For others, the predictability may have been a comfort, a steady path in a chaotic world. The convent removed the dangers of childbirth, the instability of marriage, the violence of war outside. Yet it also removed freedom, spontaneity, and personal choice. So the question lingers as the bell rings again. Did the routine bring peace, or did it slowly erode the human spirit, leaving only submission behind? The walls of the convent may have seemed permanent, solid, immovable, but history pressed against them, and cracks always appeared. To understand why life as a medieval nun could be both suffocating and strangely powerful, we need to step inside some real convents, meet the women who led them, and see how they navigated hunger, disease, and politics. Let's begin with one of the most famous names, Hildegard of Bingen, 1098–1179. Hildegard was given to a convent as a child, essentially offered up by her noble family. She lived most of her life behind walls, yet her voice reached far beyond them. She became abbess, wrote music, studied medicine, and corresponded with popes and emperors. Her visions, which she described in elaborate theological works, made her a spiritual authority. But Hildegard was an exception, almost a saint in her own time. Her story highlights the paradox. Convent life erased individuality for most, but in rare cases, it created space for extraordinary women to emerge. For every Hildegard, there were hundreds of anonymous nuns who spun wool, mended habits, and sang the same psalms for decades without their names ever entering a chronicle. In England, for example, the Abbey of Barking near London was one of the wealthiest nunneries. Founded in the 7th century and flourishing through the Middle Ages, Barking housed aristocratic women who brought large dowries. Its abbesses held power almost like secular lords, overseeing vast estates. Yet documents also show daily problems, disputes over tenants, shortages of funds, and conflicts with bishops who sought to interfere. Even in the grandest houses, survival required constant negotiation. Smaller convents faced sharper struggles. Take anchoresses, women who walled themselves up in cells attached to churches, choosing extreme enclosure. They relied entirely on the charity of outsiders for food and surcease.
Survival. Manuals like the Ancrene Visa, written in 13th century England, instructed anchoresses on how to live shut away, in prayer and discipline. Imagine that, being literally bricked into a chamber, with only a small window to receive food and confess sins. For some, it was seen as the purest form of devotion. For others, it was barely distinguishable from a slow death sentence. Crises often broke the illusion of stability. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one such moment. Heavy rains, failed harvests, and livestock disease led to widespread hunger across northern Europe. Convents, especially poorer ones, suffered directly. Records describe nuns begging for food, abbesses writing desperate letters for aid, and mortality rising sharply. The rule prescribed fasting, but famine forced starvation. In these years, the line between discipline and disaster blurred. Then came the Black Death, beginning in 1347. The plague swept across Europe, killing perhaps a third of the population. Convents were not spared. Enclosed life offered no real protection against fleas and infected rats. Entire houses of nuns perished. In some cases, only a handful survived to keep the convent technically alive. The psychological impact was immense. The rule's insistence on stability was shaken by mass death. Burial grounds filled quickly, prayers for the dead became endless, and silence deepened into grief. Those who survived faced a changed world. With fewer people, labor shortages altered the economy. Some convents gained temporary wealth from inheritances left by plague victims. Others struggled to replace lost sisters, finding it harder to recruit women into the cloister. For the nuns inside, survival was not just about prayer, but about adapting, whether by taking on new work, selling off land, or seeking favors from patrons. Politics intruded too. Kings, bishops, and local lords all saw convents as part of their sphere. They could appoint abbesses, confiscate lands, or demand support in wars. For example, during the turbulent reign of King John in England, some convents lost resources to royal demands. In France, during the 100 Years' War, convents often found themselves caught between armies. Soldiers raided supplies, and the supposed sanctity of the cloister walls offered little defense against hunger or fire. Yet, despite these pressures, convents persisted. Why? Because they were woven into the very fabric of medieval society. They offered spiritual intercession, the promise of prayers for souls in purgatory. Wealthy patrons funded convents precisely because they believed the prayers of holy women could shorten their suffering after death. This gave nuns bargaining power. A convent that promised perpetual prayers for a donor's soul could secure land, grain, or income. The abbess often acted like a landlord. She might negotiate rents, handle lawsuits, and oversee harvests. This administrative work required skill, literacy, and resilience. For a medieval woman, it was an unusual position of power, though always shadowed by oversight from male authorities. Bishops conducted visitations to inspect discipline, and their records survive. They note complaints. Nuns leaving enclosure to visit family, eating forbidden foods, or wearing clothes finer than their habits allowed. Such reports reveal both human weakness and the constant tension between ideal and reality. Let's return for a moment to daily rhythms, but now seen through these crises. Imagine the plague year. The bell still rings for matins in the dark hours before dawn, but the chapel feels half empty. Voices echo against stone where dozens once stood. The psalms continue, but with a hollow weight. After prayers, the convent saint. Ruggles to prepare breakfast. Supplies are thin, servants are dead or fled, and the nuns themselves are weakened. Silence reigns not just by rule, but by grief. Or picture the famine years. The refectory table holds bowls of thin broth, more water than grain. The bread is coarse, stretched with husks. A nun reads scripture aloud, but her voice trembles with hunger. Work in the fields grows desperate, yet yields are poor. The abbess writes to local lords, pleading for grain, but the reply comes back. There is none to give. In these moments, the cloister walls must have felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. We must also think about individual women. Not all who entered the convent did so willingly. Some were given by their families as children, their futures sealed before they could choose. Others entered after widowhood, seeking refuge. A few joined voluntarily out of genuine devotion. Their experiences were not identical. The noblewoman with a large dowry might have lighter duties and better food. The lay sister, often from a poorer background, might toil long hours in kitchens or fields. The tension between these groups simmered,
even if not often recorded openly. Education again marks a divide. In certain houses, especially those connected with cathedrals or major abbeys, nuns received substantial instruction. They learned to read Latin, copy manuscripts, and even compose. In others, literacy was minimal. The act of singing the psalms became more about memory than understanding. A nun might live her entire life repeating words she could not translate. And yet, convents also preserved knowledge. In scriptoria, manuscripts were carefully copied. Medical texts, devotional works, even classical writing survived through the patient labor of women with quills and ink. The irony is striking. Anonymous hands preserve texts that now form the backbone of our knowledge of the Middle Ages, yet the names of those women are lost. What about healthcare? Convents often ran infirmaries for their sisters, using herbal remedies. Gardens provided plants like sage, rosemary, and valerian. Honey served as an antiseptic, wine as a base for medicines. Knowledge passed down through generations, blending folk remedies with texts from scholars like Galen. Success was mixed. Some ailments eased, others worsened. Death was frequent, yet care itself was part of devotion. Tending the sick was seen as serving Christ in the body of one's sister. Through all this, the question of choice lingers. Some women may have found true purpose within the walls, safety from marriage, a space for study, a community of prayer. Others must have chafed under the restrictions, dreaming of the world outside. The cloister removed dangers, but also freedoms. Now imagine yourself at Vespers, the evening prayer. The sun is setting, light filtering through narrow windows. The chant rises, solemn and steady, voices weaving together in Latin. Outside, wars rage, famine bites, or plague spreads. But inside, the same pattern repeats. Does that rhythm bring comfort? Or does it numb the spirit, making every day feel like an endless copy of the last? And so we end this section with another thought. When history's storms battered the convent walls, did they shelter the women inside, or simply turn those walls into cages where suffering had no escape? The convent bell rings again, echoing through stone corridors, and for one more moment you stand inside those walls. After so many hours of prayer, so many years of repetition, what does it all add up to? Was the life of a medieval nun simply hardship, an endless loop of hunger, silence, and submission, or did it leave behind something lasting? To answer that, we need to step back and look at the broader picture. The convent was never just a place of retreat. It was a social institution, an economic unit, a spiritual powerhouse, and in its quiet way, a cornerstone of medieval society. First, let's consider the spiritual role. Medieval people believed deeply in the power of prayer, especially the prayers of those who had renounced the world. Nuns were seen as intercessors, lifting petitions to God not just for themselves, but for all who supported them. Families sent daughters to convents partly for prestige, but also for spiritual insurance. If a nun prayed daily for your soul, your chances in the afterlife might be better. In this sense, the convent's endless chanting of psalms was not wasted breath. It was currency, spiritual labor in exchange for earthly support. But spiritual labor alone did not sustain convents. Their economic role was equally important. Lands, mills, fisheries, and markets were often tied to religious houses. Nuns became stewards of estates, sometimes running vast tracts of farmland. Their tenants worked the land, paid rent, and in return expected protection and stability. Even small convents contributed to the local economy, producing cloth, ale, or embroidery. In an era when women had few economic roles outside marriage, nuns managed resources that rivaled the holdings of many noblemen. And then there is the educational legacy. While not every nun learned to read or write, convents were one of the few institutions where women could access liton, erasy. Some wrote letters, chronicles, and treatises. Others copied manuscripts, ensuring the survival of texts that might have otherwise vanished. Even those who did not write still absorbed scripture and chants, preserving oral traditions of devotion. The act of reading aloud in the refectory, of copying in scriptoria, or of teaching novices the Psalms, these were small threads in the tapestry of medieval learning, but threads without which much would be missing. We should also acknowledge the medical role. Infirmaries within convents offered care not just to sisters, but sometimes to outsiders. Herbal remedies, knowledge of diet, and simple nursing practices kept people alive. They may not have cured plague or famine, but they offered comfort, and in a world with limited options, that mattered. Some convents became centers of healing, their knowledge respected by surrounding communities. Now, let's think about authority. For women in medieval Europe, choices were narrow: marriage, family, or religious life. The abbess was one of the few female figures who held recognized power. She could oversee estates, negotiate with bishops, and command obedience from dozens of sisters. Though her authority was never absolute, always supervised by men, it was still remarkable in a patriarchal world. Even ordinary nuns experienced a form of collective strength, living in communities of women bound together by vows rather than by husbands or fathers. But this life had costs. Freedom was exchanged for enclosure, individuality for conformity. The silence, the hunger, the rigid schedule, these wore down the body and the spirit. We must not romanticize it. For many, the convent was not chosen but imposed. A child given at age 7, a daughter without dowry, a widow without options. These women entered not out of vision or joy, but necessity. The walls kept them safe from war and childbirth, but they also held them captive. Still, even in this confinement, meaning could be made. The rhythm of prayer shaped generations. The quiet labor of spinning, sewing, and copying manuscripts was not glamorous, but it left traces. Embroidered vestments adorned altars. Candles lit cathedrals. Books carried words across centuries. The convent was a workshop of the ordinary, and the ordinary endures. As history moved forward, convents faced new pressures. The late Middle Ages brought reform movements, criticizing lax discipline and calling for stricter observance. Some houses resisted, others complied. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation dissolved many convents entirely, especially in Northern Europe. Nuns were expelled, lands confiscated, walls torn down. What had seemed eternal proved vulnerable to politics and faith alike. Yet the legacy did not vanish. Surviving convents, especially in Catholic regions, continued their work. The model of enclosed prayer persisted, shaping spirituality for centuries. More importantly, the memory of these medieval women, their chants, their writings, their hidden labor, remained woven into the fabric of history. So what, finally, does it mean to say that it sucked to be a medieval nun? It means recognizing the cold stone walls, the hunger, the silence, the endless repetition. It means facing the lack of choice, the subordination to male authority, the crushing weight of rules that left little room for individuality. It means imagining yourself waking at 2 a.m., dragging your weary body to the chapel, and singing words you might not fully understand. But it also means acknowledging the endurance. These women carried traditions, preserved knowledge, and sustained communities. They were not merely passive victims of circumstance. They were participants in a system that both constrained and empowered them. Their lives remind us that history is not made onless by kings and warriors, but also by those who prayed, worked, and endured in silence. So, as the final bell rings in this story, picture the convent one last time. The courtyard garden, herbs bending in the wind, the chapel dimly lit by candles, the refectory echoing with scripture as bowls of bread and broth are passed, the dormitory, cold and quiet, lined with straw mattresses. Generations of women lived and died in these spaces, unseen by most of the world, yet leaving their mark in ways both subtle and profound. Their legacy lingers not in grand monuments, but in the survival of texts, the quiet influence of abbesses, and the persistent idea that devotion could be lived in community. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: history often hides the lives of the ordinary, the repetitive, the constrained. But when we pause, when we listen closely, we can still hear their chants echoing through the centuries, monotone, steady, unbroken. The convent may have felt like a prison, but in its silence, it preserved voices that still speak if we are patient enough to hear them. As the echo of bells fades from the last convent, let's step into another corner of medieval Europe, where life behind stone walls looked very different depending on wealth, status, and location. Some convents thrived on donations, political favor, and land holdings. Others struggled to scrape together enough food for the sisters. The contrasts were striking, and they shaped the lives of medieval nuns in ways both subtle and profound. Consider first a wealthy convent like Fontevraud Abbey in western France, founded in the early 12th century. Fontevraud was remarkable in several ways. It housed both men and women, though the abbess oversaw the entire community, a rare inversion of typical hierarchy. Donations from nobles poured in, often in exchange for prayers for their souls. Lands, vineyards, mills, and entire villages were part of the abbey's holdings. For nuns here, daily life still revolved around prayer, labor, and silence, but the material conditions were comparatively comfortable. Warmed halls, abundant bread, and textiles of fine wool made the burdens of fasting and labor easier to bear. Yet comfort did not eliminate routine or obligation. Even at Fontevraud, the rule dictated strict hours for prayer, communal meals, and manual labor. Nuns still rose at night for matins, chanted psalms in Latin, and spent long hours sewing or copying manuscripts. The presence of wealth changed some details: more abundant food, access to books, perhaps fewer hours of back-breaking labor, but it did not remove the monotony, the hunger in times of scarcity, or the rigor of obedience. In contrast, smaller, poorer convents faced far harsher realities. Imagine a modest nunnery on the outskirts of England or Germany. Lands were meager, rents from tenants were low, and donations were irregular. In such houses, nuns spent hours in fields planting and harvesting what little they could. If the harvest failed, they rationed food carefully, stretching grain into thin bread or watery pottage. The refectory table might offer barely enough to sustain life. Winter could feel endless, with frost creeping through unheated rooms and meager blankets. Illness spread rapidly, sometimes claiming multiple sisters in a single season. Survival here was fragile, dependent on the goodwill of local communities or the generosity of a passing noble. The differences between rich and poor houses weren't just about comfort, they shaped opportunity. Wealthy convents could afford to educate their nuns. Latin literacy, musical training, and manuscript copying were attainable. Poorer convents often focused on manual labor, spinning, weaving, and tending the garden. Education existed, but only enough to sustain prayer and basic reading. The intellectual lives of nuns were deeply influenced by the economic realities of their house. Daily life also shifted with seasonal rhythms, and these rhythms were intensified by poverty. In a small convent with little land, planting and harvest were urgent, physical, and exhausting. Fields had to be worked alongside spiritual duties. Winter forced a different struggle: long nights with limited firewood, thin meals, and frozen water. In a rich abbey, nuns might still experience the seasons, but their burdens were cushioned by stored grains, cellars stocked with preserved foods, and sometimes even imported luxuries. Another layer of contrast lay in social hierarchy within the convent. Wealthier houses often had stricter divisions: fully professed nuns, novices, and lay sisters. Lay sisters performed the bulk of physical labor, while professed nuns engaged in liturgy, manuscript work, or administration. In poorer houses, all nuns often labored in the fields and kitchens, blurring these distinctions. Even discipline varied. Wealthy abbesses might strictly enforce silence and obedience, while impoverished houses were more pragmatic, prioritizing survival over ceremonial exactitude. The political world pressed in differently as well. Rich convents were connected to networks of nobles, bishops, and even royalty. They could call on powerful allies to settle disputes or defend holdings. Poor convents, however, were vulnerable to local conflicts, marauding armies, or overzealous landlords. A single raid could destroy harvests, burn stores, or steal livestock, leaving the sisters scrambling to survive. In some cases, the convent would rely on charity, begging for grain or money just to continue living. Health and hygiene mirrored this divide. Wealthy nuns might enjoy warmer dormitories, access to fresh water, and better diets that made them more resilient against illness. Poor nuns endured damp, drafty rooms, limited food, and insufficient medical care. Outbreaks of disease hit them hardest. Yet even in wealthy houses, illness could strike unexpectedly. Disease did not respect status, though the effects could be mitigated by better nutrition and access to medical texts. Despite these disparities, all convents shared certain constants. The ritual of prayer structured each day. Silence was enforced. Labor filled the hours between prayers. Meals were taken communally, often in strict quiet. Clothing was simple, designed to enforce modesty and uniformity. Personal desires, whims, and comfort were secondary to obedience, devotion, and communal life. Economic and social pressures also influenced recruitment. Wealthy convents could attract daughters of nobility, bringing dowries that further strengthened the abbey's holdings. Poorer convents often recruited local women, sometimes children offered by families who could not provide a dowry for marriage. This affected social dynamics, creating tension between women from different backgrounds, even within a single community. We also see contrasts in labor expectations. In rich houses, some nuns were primarils, devoted to the chapel and manuscripts. Others performed domestic work. In poorer convents, labor was relentless. Fields had to be ploughed, livestock tended, fires maintained, and bread baked. In times of shortage, nuns might even sell small goods at local markets to obtain food. Spiritual life and survival intertwined in ways that left little room for rest or leisure. The physical environment reflected these economic realities. Wealthy abbeys had stone buildings, larger dormitories, gardens, and even guest houses for visitors or pilgrims. Poor convents often had modest timber or stone structures, small dormitories, and gardens just enough to sustain the sisters. Maintenance was a constant challenge. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, and winter winds could be harsh. Yet the discipline of the rule demanded order regardless of circumstances. Even food illustrates the disparity. Rich abbeys offered variety: bread, cheese, eggs, fish, and occasionally meat for the infirm. They could store wine and oil and preserve vegetables and fruits. Poor houses often survived on watery pottage, coarse bread, and herbs grown in small gardens. Hunger was never far away. Fasting and austerity, prescribed for spiritual reasons, became intertwined with real deprivation in these places. This contrast also shaped psychological experience. Nuns in wealthy abbeys might still feel confined by silence and schedule, but the material security allowed a degree of mental ease. In poor convents, the daily grind was more punishing, the stakes higher. Survival required constant attention to food, heat, and work, leaving less room for meditation or intellectual pursuits. Yet, despite disparities, the sense of purpose persisted. Every nun, whether in luxury or scarcity, followed the same cycle of prayer, labor, and obedience. Each action, spinning wool, tending a garden, copying a manuscript, was framed as devotion. Even hardship had meaning. Hunger, fatigue, and illness were seen as paths to humility and spiritual growth. The rule, though austere, provided a structure that gave life coherence, even in adversity. As you imagine these convents, one bustling with wealth and one barely surviving, the human experience comes into focus. Sisters shared the same rituals, the same prayers, the same work, but their daily realities differed sharply. Yet both communities endured, both contributed to medieval society, and both shaped the lives of women in ways rarely recorded in official chronicles. So as we leave this first glimpse of Story 2, one question hangs in the air. Does abundance within the walls ease the spiritual burden? Or does scarcity sharpen the discipline into something more acute and more human? The seasons turn, and with them the rhythm of life in every convent, whether wealthy or poor. Spring brings renewal, but also labor, planning, and the ever-present tension between spiritual obligations and survival needs. The convent garden, small or vast depending on resources, is tended with care, each seed sown as a small act of faith. Herbs for medicine, vegetables for sustenance, and flowers for the chapel are planted in neat rows. In wealthy abbeys, gardeners might assist or teach the sisters. In poorer houses, every sister's hands must toil in the soil. Planting is only the beginning. Fields must be prepared, soil turned, seeds scattered with precision and care. Nuns rise before dawn, cold air biting their cheeks, dew soaking their shoes. Even in luxury, labor is necessary. Even in scarcity, it is relentless. Tools are simple: wooden spades, iron hoes, sickles, and often worn from use. Repairs are frequent. A broken handle or dull blade slows planting, or worse, endangers harvests. Labor is intertwined with prayer. A chant accompanies each swing of a hoe, each bending of the back. The physicality of the work is as much spiritual discipline as it is survival. Spring also brings cleaning and maintenance. Convents, even wealthy ones, are subject to the elements. Stone walls trap cold, wood rots, roofs leak. Windows, often just small slits with oiled cloth or thin glass, let in wind and rain. Sisters scrub floors with water and sand, repair thatch, sweep courtyards and tend animals. Chickens, pigs, and sometimes cows need feeding and care. Even in affluent houses, these chores are daily necessities. In poorer convents, this work can dominate the day. The line between spiritual labor and physical survival blurs. Summer offers long days but brings a different kind of challenge. Crops grow quickly and demand attention. Harvest preparation begins early. Hay must be sown out and dried, grain gathered, orchards pruned. In wealthy abbeys, surplus labor might allow a group of nuns to focus on manuscript work, embroidery, or embroidery-based trade, while others work the land. In poor houses, every sister is in the fields, back aching from bending, hands calloused, sweat pouring down faces in the midday heat. Even water, if scarce, must be rationed carefully, leaving the sisters parched in silence. Labor is not always predictable. Floods, pests, or late frosts can ruin crops. In some regions, locusts or disease devastate small gardens. Wealthy convents can absorb these losses through stored grain or trade. Poor houses teeter on the brink of starvation. Letters survive from abbesses begging patrons for donations, requesting grain, or pleading for temporary assistance. Life inside the walls is only sustainable if the community adapts, improvises, and survives season to season. Food remains central to daily life. In wealthy abbeys, summer offers fresh vegetables and fruits. Gardens produce peas, beans, leeks, and herbs. Orchards yield apples and pears. Bees provide honey. Bread is baked regularly. Pottage simmered with seasonal vegetables. Cheese and eggs sometimes added. In poor convents, summer might bring slightly better sustenance, but still limited. Coarse bread, small portions of pottage, perhaps a bit of milk if the cows survive. The diet is repetitive, the monotony unbroken, but every bite is necessary for survival. Evening rituals continue. The day ends with vespers, then compline. The chant rises through stone corridors, blending with the soft sounds of creaking beams, rustling robes and distant livestock. Silence follows, deep and heavy. In winter, the darkness presses more acutely. In summer, it lingers long after the sun sets. Every day is a balance of labor, prayer, and survival, structured yet unpredictable, ordinary yet exciting. Seating. Illness and injury are never far. Cuts, bruises, and blisters from fieldwork are common. Wealthier houses might have a small infirmary, with basic herbal remedies and care, sometimes even a physician or learned sister in charge. Poor houses rely on what they can find in gardens and local markets: sage for fever, rosemary for wounds, valerian for sleep. Epidemics, smallpox, measles, dysentery, spread rapidly, especially where nutrition is low. Records of convent deaths in such years reveal clusters of sisters lost in weeks, sometimes months, leaving the remaining nuns to carry double the labor. The psychological weight of this labor cannot be underestimated. In wealthy houses, material comfort does not erase monotony, but it allows small freedoms, the chance to study, copy manuscripts, or teach novices. In poor houses, every day is survival layered atop devotion. Hunger gnaws at the body, even as the mind chants psalms. Fatigue is constant. Sleep may come in short stretches, the body pressed into straw mattresses in cold rooms. The spiritual dimension of labor, the idea that every task is a prayer, is the thread that gives the sisters purpose. Yet it is tested every day by exhaustion and scarcity. Social dynamics also play a role. Wealthier convents host novices from noble families who bring education, manners, and sometimes tension. In poorer houses, sisters are often local, of humble background, and share practical knowledge of labor, herbal remedies, and survival. Differences in background can create subtle hierarchies within the same house, distinctions in duties, status, or influence. Still, shared hardship often produces a sense of solidarity, uniting the community in a rhythm of labor and devotion. Political pressures shape life as well. Kings, lords, and bishops assert authority over convent lands and privileges. Wealthy abbeys negotiate with patrons and officia, elas seeking legal protection or land rights. Poor convents are vulnerable to requisitions, theft, or arbitrary taxation. During times of local conflict, raids, wars, or disputes over land, nuns must balance spiritual life with pragmatic action, hiding valuables, negotiating with outsiders, or rationing supplies. Survival is both material and spiritual, intertwined. Religious observances continue to structure the year. Lent, Advent, and other fasts dictate food, activity, and ritual. Wealthy houses can supplement fasting with better food for the sick or elderly. Poor houses must stretch already minimal supplies. Festivals, Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, offer a brief respite from routine, but even these are subdued. Music and celebration exist, but labor and prayer never fully pause. Every moment is framed by a balance of spiritual and physical necessity. Wealth and poverty also shape educational opportunities. In affluent convents, nuns might study Latin, theology, or music, copying manuscripts for liturgical or scholarly use. Poorer houses may focus solely on memorizing psalms and learning practical skills like cooking, gardening, and embroidery. Literacy is uneven, but even in impoverished houses, instruction occurs. Novices learn basic reading to follow prayers, record offerings, or maintain accounts. Education is practical as much as devotional. Yet amidst labor and scarcity, small joys persist. Gardens, even modest ones, offer beauty and fragrance. Chanting, though repetitive, provides rhythm and connection. Some sisters develop skill in embroidery, manuscript illumination, or gardening. Work itself, repetitive though it is, can produce satisfaction. A well-tilled field, a freshly baked loaf, a clean floor, a preserved vegetable. Even in scarcity, nuns find meaning in mastery of small tasks. Conflict within communities is rare but exists. Differences in background, status, or personality sometimes spark disputes. Abbesses must navigate personalities, labor divisions, and spiritual discipline. In small houses, everyone's actions directly affect survival. In wealthy houses, hierarchy mitigates, but does not eliminate friction. Manuals and visitation records preserve hints of these tensions, though often framed in the language of obedience, reform, or piety. As the sun sets, the day concludes with vespers once more. Silence returns. The sisters lie down on straw-filled mattresses, the cold or warmth pressing against them depending on resources. Tomorrow will bring the same labor, the same chants, the same struggles, both material and spiritual. The contrast between wealth and poverty shapes comfort, opportunity, and survival, but the underlying rhythm of life, the intertwined devotion and discipline, remains constant. And so, as the second story unfolds, one thought remains unresolved. Does material comfort ease the hardships of spiritual life? Or does scarcity sharpen the nuns' focus, resilience, and devotion in ways wealth can never replicate? Crisis, whether slow or sudden, defined medieval convent life as surely as prayer or labor. When famine struck, fields failed, or disease spread, nuns were forced to confront the limits of the walls that enclosed them. The experience of crisis varied dramatically between wealthy and poor convents, but none were entirely immune. Consider the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Rain fell in relentless torrents, rotting crops and flooding fields. Wheat, barley, and oats, staples of every convent table, failed in successive harvests. Livestock weakened and died. Wealthy abbeys could ration their stored grain, tap into financial reserves, or request aid from patrons. Letters survive from abbesses pleading for donations, recounting the ways famine threatened their communities. In some cases, the generosity of donors bridged the gap, providing sacks of grain, dried fish, or preserved vegetables. Yet even these abbeys faced stress. Dietary monotony intensified, labor fatigue grew, and the mental strain of watching novices and sisters weaken took its toll. Poor convents fared worse. Fields had yielded only enough for a single season, if that. Stored grain was gone within weeks. Meals shrank to thin broth, sometimes watered down to almost nothing. Hunger gnawed at bodies that had already been weakened by regular fasting. Illness spread easily among undernourished sisters. Records tell of nuns fainting in fields or at work tables, unable to continue. Mortality climbed. In some cases, abbesses were forced to petition nearby towns or monasteries for food, or to temporarily send sisters out to relatives, breaking enclosure rules, but preserving life. The choice between obedience and survival became painfully stark. Famine was followed decades later by plague. Beginning in 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing perhaps a third of the population. Convents were not sanctuaries. Ras, teas carrying fleas, entered dormitories. Visitors unwittingly brought infection. Supplies carried disease from nearby towns. Wealthy houses could isolate affected areas, quarantine the infirm, and draw on stores for survival. Even so, sisters fell ill quickly. Death in clusters was common. Abbesses faced the grim task of administering both spiritual care and practical management, deciding who could remain in dormitories, who needed burial quickly, and how to keep the remaining community functioning. Poor convents, already weakened by famine or scarcity, were devastated. Nuns without strong financial backing had no reserves, no backup plans. In some cases, entire houses emptied in months. Surviving sisters often struggled to maintain the cloister, tending to the sick and burying the dead themselves. Spiritual routines continued as best they could, matins, lauds, sext. But the sound of chant became intertwined with grief. Prayer took on a heavier, more desperate quality as sisters asked for intercession for the living as well as the dead. Political pressures compounded these challenges. Kings, lords, and bishops saw convents not just as spiritual institutions, but as assets. Rich abbeys often became embroiled in disputes over land, tithes, and taxation. Poor convents, lacking protection, could have crops seized, granaries emptied, or buildings commandeered for soldiers. During the 100 Years' War, English and French convents alike suffered from marauding armies, forced contributions, or outright destruction. Even in peacetime, abbesses negotiated with local officials, petitioned for exemptions, and recorded grievances to bishops in writing. Survival was both a material and administrative effort, yet these crises also revealed the resilience of convents. Systems of labor, communal discipline, and prayer provided stability amid chaos. Even when disease struck, sick nuns were tended with care in infirmaries, using herbs and remedies passed down through generations. Bread baked in smaller portions, gardens replanted carefully, and sewing or manuscript work continued whenever possible. The rule of St. Benedict and similar orders offered structure: wake, pray, labor, eat, sleep. This repeated pattern became an anchor, even when the world outside fell apart. The experience of wealth versus poverty is particularly striking in these moments. In a wealthy abbey, sisters might endure shortages but survive. In a poor house, the same challenges could decimate the community. Social networks mattered. Patrons could send aid. Letters of support could bring relief, and abbesses with political savvy could negotiate temporary reprieves. Poorer convents relied almost entirely on local goodwill, charity, and improvisation. Both groups relied on spiritual discipline to endure, but scarcity sharpened every decision, every labor, and every moment of fatigue. Crises also tested internal hierarchies. Wealthy abbeys had divisions: lay sisters, novices, and professed nuns, each with distinct duties. During famine or plague, these distinctions sometimes blurred. Everyone worked side by side to grow, cook, or distribute food. In poor convents, such distinctions were less formal. All sisters labored together. Conflict, when it arose, often centered on distribution of scarce resources, care for the sick, or obedience to abbess directives. Historical records reveal disputes recorded in visitation reports, complaints of unequal food portions, neglect, or disobedience, but also show problem-solving and solidarity. Daily life in crisis years was physically demanding and emotionally heavy. I'm a Jean walking barefoot across a frozen courtyard to fetch water, or kneeling for matins with an empty stomach. Imagine tending a sick sister, uncertain if your own body can withstand the same illness. Imagine harvesting a meager field, sweating under the sun, knowing the granary may yield nothing. Spiritual discipline offered meaning, yet could not erase exhaustion, fear, or grief. Education and labor persisted even in these years. Rich abbeys could maintain manuscript work, copying texts for future generations. Poor convents might use idle hours to repair clothing, spin wool, or tend smaller gardens. Every action had dual purpose: practical survival and spiritual devotion. Skills honed in normal years became critical under crisis. Knowledge of herbs, sewing, bookkeeping, or fieldwork saved lives. Social support, both internal and external, was crucial. Sisters formed networks of care, helping each other in work, sharing food, or taking turns at dangerous tasks like fetching water from distant wells. Wealthy convents could draw on external support from patrons, bishops, or nearby monasteries. Poor houses depended on neighbors or local clergy. Aid was uneven and often delayed, highlighting the fragility of enclosed life in hard times. The psychological effects of these crises were profound. Chanting psalms while famine or plague raged outside created a tension between spiritual purpose and bodily survival. Daily labor, essential for life, also reinforced discipline. Sleep, though limited, was structured. Silence became heavier when grief, fear, and scarcity pressed in. These conditions shaped a generation of women hardened by routine and necessity, yet sustained by faith and community. Seasonal cycles continued to shape response to crises. Spring might still bring planting, but fields were smaller, tools worn, and sisters weaker. Summer heat could amplify disease and fatigue. Autumn harvests were critical, and failure could spell disaster. Winter brought both stillness and risk: frozen water, brittle firewood, and the spread of illness indoors. Each season compounded the hardships imposed by famine, plague, or political interference. Even in crisis, small victories mattered. A successful crop, a recovered sister, a batch of bread baked without spoilage, these events were celebrated quietly, sustaining morale. Manuscripts copied carefully, candles made for the chapel, and prayers continued, each act a measure of resilience. History preserves these small triumphs as hints of human ingenuity and devotion, often overlooked in broader narratives. Yet unresolved questions linger. In wealthy abbeys, sisters could endure scarcity with minimal loss of life. In poor houses, the same crisis could devastate the community. Did material abundance change spiritual experience? Or did extreme scarcity produce a sharper sense of devotion, solidarity, and survival instinct? Did the daily grind under hardship forge a more resilient, albeit physically and emotionally taxed, community? Crisis exposed both fragility and strength. Convents were vulnerable to disease, famine, and politics, yet they persisted. Life behind the walls demanded constant adaptation, careful planning, and communal support. Spiritual discipline, labor, and obedience were both tools for endurance and sources of strain. The rhythm of daily life, wake, pray, labor, eat, sleep, remained, but its meaning was tested, stretched, and reshaped by the challenges of survival. And so, as the bell tolls once more, the story pauses, leaving a question unresolved. When scarcity, illness, and politics collide, what truly sustains a community of nuns? The wealth that cushions them, the discipline that guides them, or the shared endurance of hardship itself? As the echoes of crisis fade, the daily rhythm of convent life resumes, yet history has left its mark on both wealthy and poor houses. The legacy of these communities is not just in their walls, manuscripts, or gardens, but in the resilience, discipline, and devotion that defined life within them. To understand this, we must look back at the patterns, hardships, and subtle triumphs that shaped nuns' experiences across centuries. In wealthy convents like Fontevraud or Barking Abbey, material comfort provided a buffer against disaster, but it did not erase the obligations of the rule. Nuns still rose before dawn for matins, chanted psalms in Latin, worked in gardens or scriptoria, and observed strict discipline. Even with ample food, warmth, and educational resources, monotony and restriction shaped their days. Wealth eased certain hardships, but did not shield sisters from grief, illness, or the psychological weight of enclosure. Poor convents, by contrast, lived with scarcity as a constant companion. Every meal was measured, every laborious hour in the fields a necessity, and every illness a serious threat. Yet scarcity also sharpened skills and fostered solidarity. Sisters learned to improvise, share resources, and maintain spiritual focus despite hardship. Their devotion became intertwined with survival, and their daily rhythms were marked by both exhaustion and resilience. The experience of both types of convents demonstrates a common thread. Life inside the walls, regardless of resources, required continuous adaptation. Labor was never optional. Prayer was never secondary. Whether spinning wool, tending herbs, copying manuscripts, or managing estates, each act carried dual significance: practical and spiritual. The convents were microcosms of medieval society, with their own economies, hierarchies, and systems of governance. Wealth allowed some convents to contribute more visibly to society. Rich abbeys produced manuscripts, educated novices, and maintained strong social networks with patrons and bishops. These houses influenced local politics, owned substantial land, and preserved cultural knowledge that would survive centuries. Their nuns had access to reading, writing, and music, enabling contributions that extended beyond the cloister walls. Poor convents, though less visible, also left an imprint. They preserved practical knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and daily labor. Their communities embodied perseverance in the face of scarcity and danger, providing continuity in regions where few institutions could survive famine, plague, or political turmoil. The survival of these houses often depended on ingenuity, cooperation, and spiritual discipline rather than material wealth. Crises, famine, plague, and conflict highlighted differences between rich and poor houses, yet both revealed human endurance. Wealth could cushion the effects of catastrophe, but discipline, routine, and communal support sustained life where resources were thin. The daily cycle, wake, pray, labor, eat, sleep, provided stability amidst chaos. Sisters supported one another, maintained essential work, and preserved knowledge, even when the world outside the walls seemed to crumble. Education and literacy, uneven though they were, represent another form of legacy. In wealthy convents, nuns copied manuscripts, wrote chronicles, and recorded local history. Poor convents might focus on basic literacy for prayer and account-keeping, but they still contributed to the preservation of knowledge. In both cases, convents became repositories of culture and learning, often unnoticed by the wider world. These contributions remind us that the work of women in medieval Europe, often hidden and uncelebrated, was vital to the continuity of society. The spiritual dimension of convent life also endures as a legacy. Sisters engaged in prayer, ritual, and devotion not only for themselves, but for the communities that supported them. Families, towns, and patrons believed in the efficacy of their prayers, linking nuns to the spiritual economy of medieval Europe. Even in poverty or crisis, their work was meaningful. The monotony of daily labor and prayer, which might seem dull or oppressive, was reframed as service and intercession, giving each day purpose beyond the immediate. We must not overlook the social and political lessons. Abbesses exercised leadership, managed estates, and negotiated with secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Even within patriarchal society, convents offered women positions of responsibility and influence. These roles, whether in wealthy or poor houses, helped shape the structure of local communities. They illustrate how medieval women navigated authority, responsibility, and power within constrained circumstances, creating legacies that extended far beyond the cloister. Physical labor, healthcare, and crisis management were integral to legacy as well. Sisters cared for the sick, tended gardens, prepared food, and maintained buildings. Their knowledge of herbs, nutrition, and domestic management was practical and invaluable, particularly in poorer houses. These skills ensured survival through famine and plague, and allowed convents to remain functioning centers of stability and care. Even mundane acts, repeated year after year, left a lasting mark on the communities around them. The psychological and emotional imprint of convent life is also part of the historical legacy. Sisters lived in strict routines, with limited freedom, yet developed resilience, cooperation, and a sense of shared purpose. They endured hunger, cold, illness, and monotony, yet maintained prayer, ritual, and communal obligations. The human capacity to adapt within confinement, to find meaning in repetition, and to sustain solidarity in crisis reflects both individual and collective endurance. Even when convents were later dissolved, particularly during the Reformation in Northern Europe, the influence of their practices persisted. Manuscripts, agricultural techniques, and medicinal knowledge carried into secular life. Communities maintained memories of the nuns' labor and devotion. The architectural imprint of abbeys, the layout of gardens, and surviving artifacts continue to tell stories of women whose lives were largely hidden from historical chronicles. Ultimately, the contrast between wealthy and poor convents offers a broader reflection on medieval society. Wealth eased hardship but did not eliminate the demands of spiritual discipline. Scarcity intensified labor, but also sharpened resilience and cooperation. Both types of houses contributed to cultural preservation, spiritual practice, and social stability.
Both endured crises with resourcefulness and determination. Both left legacies that ripple into the present, reminding us that even the most constrained lives can have lasting impact. The life of a medieval nun sucked in very real ways. Confinement, hunger, monotony, risk, and a lack of freedom defined daily existence. Yet within these constraints, women exercised agency, maintained communities, preserved knowledge, and contributed to both spiritual and material life. Their experience underscores a critical historical lesson. Influence and endurance are not always measured by grandeur, wealth, or fame. Sometimes they are measured in small, persistent acts, repeated day after day, year after year, within walls that sheltered, constrained, and defined them. So, as the final bell tolls in this story, imagine the nuns of both wealthy and poor houses. The wealthy may have enjoyed more comfort, the poor endured scarcity and danger, yet all shared the same daily rhythm of prayer, labor, and obedience. Each contributed, in its own way, to the spiritual and cultural life of medieval Europe. Their endurance, skill, and devotion remind us that history is made not only by kings, battles, and grand events, but also by the quiet persistence of ordinary lives lived with purpose, discipline, and faith. The legacy is quiet, often overlooked, yet undeniable. Nuns shaped the spiritual, economic, and cultural contours of their world. Their labor preserved knowledge, sustained communities, and maintained rituals that linked the living and the dead. The walls that contained them may have seemed confining, even oppressive, but within those walls, a remarkable continuity of human endeavor unfolded. History does not always record their names, yet if we listen carefully, to manuscripts, to ruins, to the faint echo of chant, we hear them still, a testament to resilience, discipline, and enduring presence. In reflecting on rich and poor convents alike, we see the interplay of wealth, scarcity, labor, and devotion, and the profound ways these forces shaped not only medieval Europe, but the ongoing story of women's lives, community, and cultural preservation. Leaving the walls of wealthy and poor convents behind, we now travel to the more remote reaches of medieval Europe, places where the land was sparse, the population scattered, and survival depended on both ingenuity and devotion. These were frontier or rural convents, situated far from urban centers, monasteries, or episcopal oversight. Life here combined the rigor of cloistered routine with the unpredictability of wilderness, subsistence farming, and local politics. Isolation defined these houses. Some were perched on hillsides overlooking forests, rivers, or marshes. Others were tucked into valleys, reachable only by narrow paths. Supplies arrived irregularly, sometimes carried by traveling merchants, occasionally delivered by local nobles. During winter, roads became impassable, leaving convents cut off for weeks or months. This isolation affected every aspect of life: food, labor, health, and spiritual practice. Sisters had to be self-sufficient while maintaining the rhythm of prayer, obedience, and work that the rule demanded. The daily schedule remained structured around the canonical hours: matins at dawn, lauds in the early morning, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, each hour marked by chanting, kneeling, and reflection. In frontier convents, these prayers were accompanied by the sounds of the wild: birds, wind through the trees, distant rivers, or even wolves in winter. Unlike urban houses, there was no nearby choir or market to interrupt the rhythm. The solitude intensified both the spiritual focus and the psychological weight of enclosure. Labor dominated the day. Frontier convents often relied on subsistence farming: small fields of barley, oats, peas, and beans, gardens with herbs and vegetables, orchards with a handful of fruit trees. Livestock were modest: chickens for eggs, goats for milk, perhaps a cow or two if the estate allowed. Sisters carried out all aspects of work themselves, from ploughing and sowing to harvesting and preserving. In some houses, novices learned essential skills quickly, as every pair of hands mattered. Tools were simple: wooden ploughs, iron sickles, hoes, and hand spades.
Maintenance of these tools was a daily task, as broken implements could jeopardize both harvest and survival. Winter presented unique challenges. Water sources froze, wood for fires was scarce, and food stores dwindled. Sisters spent hours chopping firewood, hauling water, and preserving the last vegetables in cellars. Illnesses spread easily in cold, damp quarters. Wealthier frontier houses might have insulated stone walls and more provisions. Poorer houses endured long nights shivering on straw mattresses, hungry and exhausted. The daily cycle of labor, prayer, and maintenance became a test of endurance. Isolation also shaped education and literacy. Frontier convents had limited access to manuscripts, teachers, or external instruction. Sisters often relied on oral teaching, passing down psalms, prayers, and practical knowledge from one generation to the next. In some houses, nuns maintained rudimentary libraries, often copied locally, but these were rare. Literacy was uneven. Some nuns could read Latin, write letters, or record accounts. Others memorized prayers and managed the physical tasks essential to survival. Education was a matter of practicality and devotion rather than scholarly aspiration. The natural environment imposed further demands. Frontier convents faced floods, storms, crop failures, and wild animal threats. Predators like wolves could attack livestock. Harsh rains could wash away crops. Early frosts could destroy fields. Unlike convents near towns or wealthy donors, these houses could not rely on rapid external aid. Survival depended on careful planning, cooperative labor, and knowledge pass. Through generations, which herbs were safe, which crops thrived locally, how to store grain through winter, and how to preserve meat and dairy. Social life within these remote houses was shaped by necessity. Sisters shared both labor and leisure, and hierarchy was practical as well as spiritual. The abbess managed both obedience and survival. She assigned work, oversaw harvests, and mediated disputes, while ensuring that prayer continued on schedule. Novices learned quickly that failure to fulfill physical duties had immediate consequences: less food, unfinished work, or disruption of the daily rhythm. Cooperation was essential. Division could mean famine or exhaustion for all. Interaction with the outside world was infrequent but crucial. Local lords, traveling merchants, or pilgrims provided rare contact. Patrons might send donations of grain, cloth, or tools, sometimes in exchange for prayers for deceased relatives or for protection from misfortune. Occasionally, abbesses negotiated with neighbors over land use, water rights, or protection from raiders. Political awareness, though subtle, was necessary. Isolation did not mean absence from local conflicts. The convent existed both as a spiritual sanctuary and as a participant in a fragile, rural economy. Crises struck differently in frontier houses. Famine could be more severe than in urban convents because crop failure meant there was no nearby market to buy substitutes. Plague, when it reached isolated communities, spread more slowly but could be devastating, particularly if there were few medical supplies or literate sisters to consult texts. Environmental hazards, forest fires, heavy snowfall, floods, added unpredictability. The nuns' response combined practicality and spiritual discipline, rationing food, tending the sick, and offering prayers for both survival and divine guidance. Frontier life also fostered a particular type of resilience. Sisters developed intimate knowledge of the land, from the growth cycles of crops to the habits of animals. He preserved seeds, maintained tools, and mastered herbal remedies. Even the youngest novices learned quickly how to repair a leaky roof, how to store vegetables, how to stretch a small loaf of bread to feed many. These skills, though ordinary, were essential to the survival of both sisters and convent itself. Daily chores, combined with prayer, created a rhythm that was repetitive yet purposeful. Washing linens, tending gardens, cooking, repairing buildings, and managing animals were all framed as devotional acts. The physical and spiritual labor intertwined. A chore was both a practical necessity and a form of service. Silence punctuated work hours, amplifying awareness of the body,
surroundings, and internal discipline. Yet isolation came with psychological costs. Loneliness, monotony, and fear of external threats pressed constantly. Without the distractions of towns or urban convents, sisters confronted their own thoughts and emotions. Silence, meant to facilitate devotion, could magnify anxiety or grief. The bond of community became essential. Shared labor, meals, and prayer offered stability, mutual support, and a sense of purpose amidst uncertainty. Frontier convents were also shaped by seasonal work cycles. Spring demanded preparation and planting. Summer required tending and weeding. Autumn brought harvest. Winter necessitated preservation, repair, and care of the infirm. Each season imposed new challenges while reinforcing the rhythm of life. Unlike urban houses with easier access to trade or resources, frontier nuns were acutely aware that failure in one season could threaten survival in the next. Religious observances provided both structure and solace. Feast days, fasts, and saintly commemorations punctuated the year. Rituals maintained a connection to broader spiritual networks, despite geographic isolation. Even in hardship, liturgical practices pursed docils. Instead, chanting, kneeling, processions within the cloistered space. These rituals framed the passage of time, linking sisters to generations of nuns who had walked the same routine centuries earlier. Yet despite careful planning, crises tested every frontier house. Crop failure, illness, or political pressure could disrupt the delicate balance of survival. Sisters were forced to improvise, rely on each other, and make difficult choices, rationing food, dividing labor, or temporarily suspending some duties. Daily life became a series of decisions, balancing spiritual obligations with practical survival. And so, as we end this first glimpse into frontier convent life, one question lingers unresolved. Does isolation intensify devotion, sharpen survival instincts, or deepen the sense of vulnerability that defines life behind the walls? The first light of spring breaks over the hills surrounding a frontier convent, painting frost-tipped fields with pale gold. Inside the walls, the nuns rise as always, the cold stone floors sending shivers through their bare feet. Despite the isolation, the rhythm of daily life proceeds with mechanical precision. Matins, lauds, prime, then the work of the day. But spring carries urgency beyond routine. It marks the beginning of planting, a season that determines survival through the harsh months ahead. In these rural houses, gardens are modest yet vital. Rows of peas, beans, onions, leeks, and herbs are tilled with hand tools. Every seed counts. Crops must be sown in the correct sequence, considering soil type, sunlight, and anticipated rainfall. Sisters learn to read the land as much as the Psalms, where the soil is moist, where frost lingers, and how drainage channels must be dug to prevent flooding. Mistakes can mean the difference between a meal every day and weeks of hunger. Spring also brings maintenance tasks. The convent's wooden structures need constant attention. Roof thatch patched, doors reinforced, beams checked for rot. Stone walls, though more durable, must be cleared of moss and lichen to prevent seepage. Wells are cleaned, rainwater cisterns inspected, and small irrigation channels repaired. These tasks, though physically exhausting, are intertwined with the spiritual rhythm. Each sweep of the broom, each scrubbed floor, is framed as service to God and the community. Labor is relentless. In wealthier frontier houses, a small number of lay sisters or servants may ease the burden, allowing some nuns to focus on copying manuscripts or preparing herbs. In poorer or more isolated convents, every sister contributes equally, whether spinning wool, repairing tools, tending livestock, or cooking. Injuries, a cut from a sickle, a bruise from lifting heavy sack, aches of grain are common. Sisters treat themselves and each other with basic herbal remedies, relying on centuries of transmitted knowledge. Sage for fever, chamomile for digestive upset, willow bark for pain.
Water collection is a constant task. Wells may be shallow, requiring long hours to draw buckets manually. In winter or early spring, frost complicates the process. In summer, water may run low. Water is needed not only for drinking and cooking, but also for washing, cleaning, and preparing the small infirmary. The act of carrying water becomes almost ritualized, a chore, a physical necessity, and a spiritual practice in one. As spring progresses into summer, the fields demand vigilance. Weeding, pest control, and irrigation occupy many hours. Crops are delicate, vulnerable to the unpredictable temper of nature. A late frost can ruin seedlings. A sudden storm can flatten growing plants. Even small pests, a swarm of locusts or an infestation of caterpillars, require attention. Sisters patrol the fields, physically removing pests, tying vines, and applying herbal treatments. In these moments, labor is both a battle against the natural world and a spiritual exercise in patience and diligence. The physical landscape influences social interactions within the convent. Sisters coordinate labor in pairs or small groups, supporting one another during difficult tasks. Novices learn quickly from experienced nuns how to handle tools safely, how to store vegetables, how to assess which herbs are ready for harvest. In isolation, mistakes have immediate consequences. The survival of the community depends on both individual skill and collective effort. Cooperation is essential, but so is discipline. Abbesses monitor not only work output, but adherence to spiritual obligations. Prayers must continue even as hands are calloused and backs ache. Food, as always, shapes the rhythm of the day. In wealthier frontier houses, gardens and small fields may provide a modest abundance of vegetables, supplemented by cheese, eggs, and sometimes fish or meat. In poorer houses, meals are frugal, thin pottage, coarse bread, and the occasional herb or preserved vegetable. Summer harvests provide some relief, but preservation is crucial. Sisters dry herbs, store root vegetables in cool cellars, and sometimes ferment small batches of grains or vegetables to last through winter. Survival is as much about planning and knowledge as it is about labor. The natural environment adds complexity. Frontier convents face storms, floods, and droughts. Heavy rain can wash away seeds or spoil stored grain. Forest fires, though rare, threaten entire houses. Wild animals, wolves, foxes, or even deer, interfere with livestock and crops. Nuns develop intimate knowledge of the surrounding landscape, which plants repel pests, where to dig drainage channels, how to secure livestock overnight. This knowledge is transmitted orally, reinforced through practice, and essential for survival. Isolation intensifies both devotion and vulnerability. Without regular visitors, sisters are responsible for both spiritual and material governance. Abbesses handle disputes, negotiate with local lords, and maintain order among novices. Decisions about labor allocation, rationing food, or responding to sickness are made collectively, yet guided by the abbess's authority. Conflict is rare but possible. Arguments over chores, harvest allocation, or perceived inequities may arise, yet survival necessitates compromise. Social cohesion is essential. Crises can strike suddenly. A late frost can devastate crops. Illness can spread through poorly nourished communities. Neighboring political disputes may spill over, threatening property or autonomy. Sisters must improvise, constantly, rationing food, altering planting schedules, or reorganizing labor. Richer houses may have small reserves or supportive patrons. Poorer houses rely on ingenuity and shared effort. Every day becomes a delicate balance between spiritual obligations and physical necessity. Even leisure and ritual are framed by necessity. Festivals and feast days offer brief relief from labor, yet planning for survival continues in the background. Processions, prayers, and communal chanting are not merely symbolic. They mark time, reinforce community cohesion, and provide mental and emotional sustenance. The convent becomes a microcosm where every activity, prayer, labor, maintenance, teaching, is intertwined with both survival and devotion. Education remains practical. Novices learn literacy sufficient to follow prayers, manage accounts, or communicate with patrons. They learn to read the seasons, tend livestock, preserve crops, and prepare simple remedies. Skills are passed down by demonstration, oral instruction, and supervised practice. In isolated houses, literacy may be limited, yet knowledge is not. The sisters' understanding of survival, labor, and the natural world forms a repository as valuable as any manuscript library. Psychological endurance is critical. Silence, intended to foster reflection and spiritual focus, can intensify feelings of isolation or anxiety. Fatigue, hunger, and repetitive labor weigh heavily, yet the structure of the day provides anchor points. Prayer at set hours, shared meals, communal tasks. Sisters rely on each other for emotional support, encouragement, and guidance. Even mundane acts, sweeping floors, tending fires, chopping wood, become markers of resilience. As summer gives way to autumn, the harvest dictates the success of the entire year. Grain must be cut, threshed, and stored, vegetables and fruits preserved, herbs dried. Every task requires coordination, knowledge, and stamina. Success ensures winter survival. Failure threatens starvation. The stakes reinforce the interdependence of sisters, the authority of the abbess, and the connection between spiritual practice and practical labor. And so, as the convent settles into the long rhythm of seasonal work, one unresolved question remains. Does the combination of isolation, labor, and devotion strengthen the spiritual focus of nuns, or does it amplify vulnerability, fear, and the precariousness of life on the frontier? Frontier convents, for all their isolation, were never entirely shielded from crisis. Life at the edges of settled territory exposed sisters to the unpredictable forces of nature, politics, and disease. Each day combined labor, prayer, and vigilance, but occasionally, extraordinary events demanded extraordinary responses. The experience of crisis in these houses illustrates both the fragility and the resilience of cloistered communities far from urban centers. Consider a convent situated along a flood-prone river valley. Seasonal rains arrive unpredictably, sometimes swelling waterways that threaten both fields and buildings. Sisters rise before dawn to inspect embankments, digging trenches or reinforcing banks with stones and soil. These tasks are physically demanding and dangerous, yet essential to protect the harvest and maintain the structure of the convent. A sudden storm might undo hours of work in minutes, forcing the community to respond rapidly, repair damage, and salvage supplies. The experience creates a rhythm where vigilance and labor intertwine with spiritual practice, reinforcing the idea that physical survival is inseparable from communal discipline. Other environmental crises compound the challenges. Droughts can parch fields, reduce water for cooking and cleaning, and weaken livestock. Wildfires, though infrequent, can devastate woodland and crops, requiring sisters to fight flames or construct fire breaks. Even winters bring hazards beyond cold: frozen wells, rotting food in poorly ventilated cellars, and the spread of contagious illness among tightly grouped sisters. Knowledge of herbal remedies and preservation techniques becomes a lifeline. Elder nuns pass down instructions for drying herbs, storing root vegetables, and preparing poultices, practical knowledge essential for survival. Disease remains one of the most formidable threats. Without frequent access to physicians or apothecaries, sisters rely on internal expertise, herbal medicine, and strict hygiene practices. Illnesses such as dysentery, respiratory infections, or fevers could incapacitate a convent quickly. The abbess must balance spiritual care with practical management, assigning nursing duties, rationing food, and isolating the sick if possible. Even minor ailments could become serious, particularly in houses already weakened by scarcity or environmental stress. Frontier convents were also affected by local politics. Lords and knights occasionally demanded contributions or labor from convents, viewing them as both spiritual centers and economic assets. Land disputes or feuds could spill into convent holdings. Abbesses, therefore, needed a combination of diplomacy, negotiation, and authority. Correspondence with nearby monasteries, local nobility, or episcopal authorities documented these negotiations. requests for protection, appeals against arbitrary taxation, or agreements over land use. Survival required not only spiritual discipline, but also political acumen. Social dynamics within the house could become tense during crises. Labor was physically demanding, food was scarce, and every decision about rationing or work allocation carried weight. Abbesses were responsible for maintaining order, distributing tasks, and resolving disputes. Novices learned quickly that inexperience or inattention could endanger not only themselves, but the entire community. Cooperation and mutual reliance were essential, and the spiritual framework of prayer and obedience supported both discipline and morale. In times of environmental crisis, labor shifted accordingly. If crops were threatened by pests, sisters spent long hours hand-picking insects, applying natural remedies, or reinforcing protective measures. Flooded fields required drainage work. Winter ice required hauling firewood, thawing wells, and tending livestock indoors. These tasks were physically exhausting, yet framed as service and devotion. The repetition, monotony, and constant vigilance formed the core of daily life, and failure could have severe consequences. Food scarcity intensified the pressures of crisis. Even wealthy frontier convents had limited storage capacity and had to ration carefully. Poorer houses often relied entirely on what could be grown or foraged locally. A late frost or prolonged drought could reduce grain stores to a few days' supply. Sisters prepared thin pottage, bread from coarse grains, and preserved vegetables with great care. Livestock provided additional food, but slaughtering an animal was a serious decision, balancing immediate sustenance with long-term survival needs. Religious observances persisted amidst crisis. Prayer, chanting, and ritual maintained temporal and spiritual order. Feast days and fasts marked the year, linking sisters to broader spiritual networks. These rituals offered psychological relief, structure, and a sense of continuity. Even in times of scarcity or disaster, nuns found solace in repetition, rhythm, and shared devotion. Spiritual practice and survival intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Education and practical knowledge also proved crucial. Literacy, though limited, allowed abbesses to maintain records, write to patrons, or petition authorities. Practical knowledge, agriculture, animal husbandry, preservation, and medicine ensured survival. Novices learned under pressure, acquiring skills quickly because mistakes carried immediate consequence. Oral teaching, demonstration, and apprenticeship formed the foundation of knowledge transfer, ensuring continuity even when external resources were scarce. Crisis could also intensify psychological pressures. Isolation magnified fear, fatigue, and anxiety. Silence, intended to promote reflection, sometimes amplified awareness of danger or scarcity. Sisters relied heavily on communal support, shared labor, and structured prayer to sustain morale. The abbess played a key role. Her leadership, foresight, and example shaped both the spiritual and practical resilience of the house. Frontier convents also dealt with external threats such as raiding bands, thieves, or marauding soldiers. Though rare, these events required preparedness. Sisters might secure valuables, reinforce doors, or hide provisions. In some cases, they negotiated temporary protection from local authorities. The combination of isolation and vulnerability demanded constant alertness, resourcefulness, and community cohesion. Even ordinary repetitive tasks became critical under crisis conditions. Sweeping floors, fetching water, preparing meals, tending gardens, spinning wool, all took on heightened importance. Mistakes or neglect could have serious consequences. The physical and spiritual labor of the convent were inseparable. Tending crops was a necessity, but also framed as devotion. Caring for the sick was an obligation, but also a spiritual exercise. Every act carried dual significance. Despite these pressures, frontier convents demonstrated remarkable resilience. Sisters adapted to environmental conditions, managed scarce resources, maintained spiritual routines, and supported each other in times of need. Seasonal cycles, crises, and isolation shaped a generation of women skilled in survival, practical knowledge, and spiritual discipline. Life behind the walls demanded flexibility, endurance, and constant vigilance. Yet unresolved questions linger, echoing in the corridors of these remote houses. When faced with relentless environmental challenges, limited resources, and political pressures, what ultimately sustains the community, the spiritual discipline that structures daily life, the practical skills that ensure survival, or the cohesion and solidarity of sisters supporting one another in isolation. As the seasonal crises subside and the fields yield their final harvest, the frontier convent enters a period of reflection and endurance. Life, as always, follows the rhythm of prayer, labor, and communal responsibility. But now the sisters can pause, if only briefly, to consider the results of their efforts, the lessons of survival, and the subtle impact of their existence on the surrounding region. Frontier convents, for all their isolation, were not detached from the wider world. They maintained ties with local lords, traveling merchants, and ecclesiastical authorities. Letters, petitions, and occasional visits connected these remote houses to networks of influence, protection, and material support. Even when separated by days or weeks of travel, the convent's activities, harvests, labor, manuscript copying, and care of the sick, contributed to the spiritual and economic life of the surrounding communities. In this sense, isolation did not equate to insignificance. Rather, it sharpened the convent's role as a self-reliant yet interconnected node within medieval society. The legacy of labor and practical skill is particularly striking. Sisters in frontier houses mastered agriculture under challenging conditions, learned animal husbandry, and preserved food for winter months. They repaired buildings, maintained water systems, and created medicines from herbs found nearby. These skills were vital not only to survival, but also to the continuity of the house. Historical records, account books, visitation reports, and letters attest to the meticulous care required to manage these tasks successfully. Each act of work was a testament to the nuns' resilience, ingenuity, and dedication. Physical labor, though taxing, was inseparable from spiritual practice. The rule of St. Benedict, followed in many houses, framed work as devotion. Sweeping the floors, tending gardens, fetching water, and cooking meals were not merely chores, they were acts of service. Even in moments of extreme fatigue, the sisters understood that diligence in labor reinforced discipline, character, and spiritual purpose. This interplay of the physical and the spiritual defined frontier convent life as much as the more visible aspects of prayer and ritual. Education and literacy, though uneven, also contributed to legacy. Frontier convents often maintained small libraries of devotional texts, legal documents, and occasionally copied manuscripts. Abbesses recorded inventories, corresponded with patrons, and documented crises. Novices learned practical literacy to follow prayers, maintain records, and communicate externally. This combination of practical and spiritual education ensured that knowledge, whether about agriculture, preservation, or ritual, was preserved across generations. Even in isolated houses, intellectual continuity mattered. The spiritual dimension of life remained a source of resilience. Sisters engaged in the canonical hours, observed feast days, and maintained devotional practices even under stress. Prayer structured daily life, provided emotional support, and reinforced communal bonds. In times of famine, illness, or political pressure, ritual offered stability and a sense of purpose. Chanting, kneeling, and reading psalms were more than formal observances. They were markers of endurance, focus, and connection to both divine and human communities. Crises, whether environmental, health-related, or political, revealed the strengths and vulnerabilities of frontier houses. Floods, droughts, wildfires, and crop failure demanded resourcefulness and coordination. Illness tested both practical knowledge and communal care. Political pressures required negotiation, diplomacy, and sometimes sacrifice. Yet despite these challenges, convents persisted. Sisters Ada, Petered, shared knowledge, supported each other, and maintained spiritual practice. Survival was never guaranteed, but the combination of discipline, cooperation, and practical skill ensured continuity. The social dynamics of frontier convents were shaped by necessity. Abbesses provided leadership and mediated disputes. Novices learned both obedience and initiative, understanding that each task mattered to the entire community. Daily life emphasized cooperation and mutual support, reinforcing the bonds of solidarity that allowed sisters to endure hardship. Hierarchies existed, but were functional rather than purely symbolic. The survival of the house depended on skill, diligence, and reliability as much as on formal rank. Frontier convents also contributed to the surrounding regions, despite their isolation. They provided medical care using herbal remedies, preserved seeds, and knowledge of cultivation techniques, and maintained records that could be consulted by neighboring communities. Their existence supported local economies through trade of surplus produce, textiles, or manuscript labor. Even when small or impoverished, these convents were integral nodes in social and spiritual networks, extending influence far beyond the walls of the cloister. The psychological endurance required in these remote houses is striking. Silence, isolation, and repetitive labor could weigh heavily on sisters, yet communal routines provided support. Prayer and ritual offered structure and solace, while practical tasks reinforced agency and purpose. Sisters learned resilience not only through spiritual practice, but through facing tangible challenges: frost, flood, hunger, or illness. This combination of mental, physical, and spiritual endurance shaped both individuals and communities. Environmental knowledge accumulated over decades became a subtle yet profound legacy. Sisters understood the cycles of crops, the behavior of animals, the properties of local herbs, and the preparation of food for preservation. They mastered techniques to protect the convent from natural hazards, maintain clean water supplies, and prevent disease. This knowledge was transmitted orally and through demonstration, ensuring continuity even when external resources were scarce or unavailable. The historical record reveals that frontier convents, though often small and obscure, influenced both the physical and spiritual landscape. The labor of nuns shaped agricultural practices, preserved knowledge of survival, and maintained continuity in regions otherwise vulnerable to scarcity or instability. Their devotion reinforced the spiritual economy of medieval Europe, linking patrons, local communities, and broader ecclesiastical networks. These convents exemplify the complex interplay of isolation, labor, and spirituality that defined monastic life in remote areas. Wealth and scarcity, visible in larger or smaller houses, framed experience but did not fully determine resilience. Richer frontier convents could store surplus food, maintain better infrastructure, and access resources through patronage. Poorer houses depended entirely on local production, improvisation, and cooperation. Both endured isolation, environmental risk, and political pressures. Both required rigorous discipline and unwavering attention to routine. The contrast highlights how resource management shaped daily life, yet the core of survival relied on collective skill, spiritual focus, and adaptability. Reflecting on frontier convent life illuminates broader historical lessons. Nuns in remote houses exemplify the combination of practical skill, spiritual devotion, and communal governance necessary to sustain life in marginal conditions. Their existence demonstrates that historical significance is not measured solely by fame, wealth, or political power, but also by persistence, ingenuity, and influence on both material and cultural landscapes. The labor, prayer, and resilience of these women shaped their communities and left an enduring mark on history even when their names remain unknown. The daily grind, fetching water, tending gardens, preserving crops, repairing buildings, and maintaining routine prayer, was arduous, repetitive, and often invisible to outsiders. Yet it was precisely this persistence that ensured continuity. Each generation of sisters learned from the last, preserving techniques, rituals, and practices that allowed convents to survive environmental, social, and political pressures. The legacy of these houses is subtle but profound, visible in manuscripts, agricultural practices, local traditions, and the faint echo of monastic rhythm in surviving ruins. Ultimately, the life of a frontier nun challenges assumptions about medieval women, monasticism, and the intersections of labor and spirituality. These women were both constrained and empowered, confined within walls, yet skilled in survival, governance, and cultural preservation. Their days were filled with physical toil and spiritual observance, isolation and interconnection, vulnerability and resilience. The impact of their work, though quiet, shaped the physical, spiritual, and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. The story of these remote convents concludes not with triumph or spectacle, but with reflection. The enduring legacy of frontier houses lies in their combination of discipline, practical knowledge, spiritual devotion, and communal resilience, a testament to the quiet but transformative influence of ordinary lives constrained by walls, yet expansive in impact. The political landscape of medieval Europe was complex, and convents were not immune. Rich abbeys often held extensive estates, generating revenue from tenant farmers, mills, and marketplaces. Abbesses acted as stewards, administrators, and negotiators, managing not only spiritual life within the walls, but also the economic and legal obligations of the house. This dual role required constant attention, supervising labor, recording rents, negotiating disputes, and corresponding with both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Consider a convent near the border of two feuding principalities. The abbess must maintain loyalty to one ruler while ensuring the convent is protected from incursions by another. Letters and charters survive in some archives, detailing agreements for safe passage, exemptions from taxes, and permissions to hold markets on convent lands. These documents reveal meticulous attention to detail, specifying grain quotas, labor obligations, and terms of protection. Every word mattered, as failure to comply with secular authority could threaten both survival and autonomy. Daily life for nuns in such politically engaged houses was shaped by this tension between enclosure and obligation. Canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, remained the framework of the day. Yet in parallel, sisters managed estates, sorted correspondence, and recorded transactions. Lay sisters tended gardens, livestock, and kitchens, while the abbess and professed nuns handled administration. Even mundane tasks carried political significance. The quality of bread baked for tenants reflected on the convent's reputation, and the timeliness of harvest collection influenced local alliances. The abbess's authority was central to the functioning of the house. She coordinated work assignments, adjudicated disputes among sisters, and maintained compliance with both the rule and secular obligations. Letters from bishops, royal officials, and local lords survive, illustrating the fine line she walked. A delayed payment of tithes, a mismanaged mill, or a dispute over land boundaries could result in fines, visitation, or even temporary seizure of property. The abbess balanced spiritual duties with practical governance, a role requiring literacy, legal knowledge, diplomacy, and keen observation. Record-keeping was essential. Account books, charters, and correspondence documented labor, rents, and gifts. Every field harvested, every animal sold, and every tithe collected had to be recorded. Sisters skilled in literacy maintained ledgers, prepared petitions, and copied charters. Even in crises, crop failure, illness, or raids, administration could not stop entirely, as legal obligations persisted. These records, painstakingly maintained, now provide historians with detailed insights into convent life, economic networks, and the scope of women's authority in medieval Europe. Environmental and logistical challenges further shaped daily life. Estates could be disrupted by floods, fires, or poor harvests. Sisters traveled to inspect lands, supervise tenant labor, or oversee mills. Roads were often in poor condition, and travel could be dangerous due to thieves, hostile neighbors, or natural obstacles. Supplies, grain, wood, or textiles required careful planning and storage. Sisters learned to anticipate scarcity, ration provisions, and coordinate labor across dispersed estates, blending spiritual discipline with practical problem-solving. Political crises could exacerbate challenges. During periods of war or contested succession, convent lands might be occupied, requisitioned, or taxed by rival authorities. Abbesses had to negotiate, petition, and sometimes pay bribes to protect property and community. Letters in archives document these efforts, revealing detailed negotiations, appeals for protection, and strategies to maintain autonomy. Even in peacetime, balancing obligations to multiple authorities required vigilance, careful record-keeping, and strategic foresight. Social structure within politically active houses reflected both necessity and tradition. Professed nuns managed administration and labor coordination, lay sisters performed essential manual tasks, and novices learned both obedience and practical skills. Hierarchy was functional. Leadership, experience, and literacy dictated responsibilities. Cooperation was essential. A mismanaged estate could threaten survival, while efficient labor and careful administration reinforced both spiritual and material security. Food production remained a key concern. Gardens, fields, orchards, and livestock provided sustenance for the sisters and sometimes for tenants or travelers. Managing these resources required careful planning, harvesting crops, preserving vegetables, and storing grain to last through winter. Even simple tasks, like baking bread or milking goats, had layers of significance, sustaining life within the convent while supporting broader obligations. Liturgical life continued alongside these secular duties. Prayer, chanting, and ritual reinforced discipline, communal bonds, and spiritual purpose. Canonical hours punctuated the day, offering moments of reflection and stability amidst administrative and labor demands. Feast days and fasts structured the year, integrating the convent into the spiritual rhythms of the wider community. Sister T was balanced devotion with practical responsibility, demonstrating that spiritual practice and governance could coexist, though never without tension. Education and literacy underpinned all of this activity. Abbesses and senior nuns needed to read and write for estate management, correspondence, and legal petitions. Novices learned these skills gradually, acquiring both literacy and practical knowledge essential to sustaining the house. Manuscripts, charters, and account books reveal the sophistication of convent administration, illustrating that these women were not passive observers of medieval society, but active participants in economic, legal, and political networks. Crisis management, whether environmental, social, or political, shaped both the experience and the legacy of these convents. Floods, disease, or failed harvests required adaptive strategies. Political pressure demanded negotiation and careful diplomacy. The balance between spiritual duties and practical obligations was delicate, and missteps could have serious consequences. Yet survival, in both senses of sustaining life and preserving spiritual integrity, was achievable through discipline, cooperation, and skill. Even routine work, cleaning, cooking, tending livestock, had political implications. The abbess's oversight reflected on the house's reputation, while diligent management of estates demonstrated competence to patrons and authorities. Sisters internalized the connection between practical efficiency and spiritual discipline. Their labor, obedience, and care were intertwined with the broader responsibilities of leadership and communal survival. And so, as the sun sets over a convent perched on contested lands, the sisters gather for Vespers, reflecting on a day filled with labor, prayer, and negotiation. The balance between spiritual devotion and worldly obligation is never fully resolved, aiding the community to navigate uncertainty with vigilance, skill, and faith. One question hangs in the air, unresolved, as we pause here. In the constant interplay of spiritual duty and political responsibility, what ultimately sustains the abbess and her community, the discipline of prayer, the skill of governance, or the solidarity of sisters bound together in shared purpose. The first frost of autumn approaches the land surrounding the convent, and within the walls, the sisters begin the work of preparing for the long months ahead. Harvesting grain, preserving vegetables, and tending to livestock dominate daily life, but in politically active houses, these tasks carry additional layers of responsibility. Every sheaf of wheat, barrel of ale, or loaf of bread reflects not only survival, but also the careful management of estates, obligations to tenants, and accountability to patrons and lords. In wealthy houses, the abbess oversees multiple fields, orchards, mills, and pastures, often spread across several miles. Each plot requires inspection, soil quality, crop yield, and the condition of tools and structures. Sisters and lay workers coordinate labor in small teams, reporting findings to the abbess. Discrepancies in accounts or missed work can lead to disputes with tenants, requiring delicate negotiation. The daily rhythm of labor, planting, harvesting, threshing, and preserving, is interwoven with ritual, prayer, and the continual documentation necessary to maintain legitimacy and authority. Poorer houses face similar demands under more constrained conditions. Fields may be smaller, harvests meager, and storage limited. Sisters themselves often perform the bulk of physical labor, while novices assist in both the spiritual and practical work. Every failure carries consequences: insufficient food for winter, disputes over rent or tithes, or reputational damage with local authorities. In these conditions, the abbess's skill in planning, delegating, and negotiating is vital. Each decision blends spiritual, practical, and political considerations. Communication plays a central role in governance. Letters to lords, bishops, and local officials record rents, petitions for protection, or resolutions to disputes. Abbesses meticulously maintained ledgers, noting contributions, obligations, and shortfalls. These records reflect the constant balancing act, honoring spiritual duties within the convent while safeguarding the material well-being of the estate. The dual responsibilities required literacy, numerical skill, and careful attention to detail. Errors or delays could jeopardize both spiritual reputation and physical survival. Political disputes occasionally threatened stability. Lords might challenge the convent's right to hold certain lands or levy tithes. Neighboring estates could encroach on property or contest boundaries. Abbesses often had to engage in negotiation, arbitration, or even legal appeals, sometimes traveling to local courts or ecclesiastical authorities. These responsibilities required tact, knowledge of local custom, and the ability to maintain authority without provoking hostility. Failure to do so could endanger both the community and the convent's income. Seasonal labor remained relentless. Autumn harvests required careful planning and efficient work. Grain must be cut, threshed, and stored. Vegetables and fruit must be preserved. Animals require feeding, shelter, and preparation for winter. Sisters coordinate these tasks with discipline. Novices learn the precise timing of each action, from when to cut oats to how to check root vegetables for spoilage. In this context, failure is immediate and tangible. A neglected granary can result in spoilage. Mismanaged livestock can lead to starvation. Improper preservation of vegetables can leave the house vulnerable to scarcity. In parallel, spiritual life continues. Canonical hours, ritual observances, and daily prayer structure the day. Even when labor demands peak, sisters maintain moments of reflection, chanting psalms and kneeling in silence. These routines offer psychological relief, reinforce communal bonds, and remind sisters that their work, whether administrative, agricultural, or manual, is framed by devotion. In politically engaged houses, this intertwining of labor and prayer underscores the dual responsibilities of governance and spiritual discipline. Crises can disrupt even well-planned routines. Late frosts threaten crops, early snows impede travel and supply routes, and illness can incapacitate multiple sisters at once. In such moments, Leadership is critical. The abbess must reorganize labor, ration supplies, and ensure continuity of prayer and governance. She may call upon external support, petition patrons, or negotiate with local authorities to protect both the convent and its dependents. Each crisis tests both the resilience of the community and the competence of its leadership. Food management is central to survival. Grain storage, preserved vegetables, and animal husbandry provide sustenance through winter, but these resources must be carefully monitored. Sisters weigh portions, plan meals, and anticipate shortages. Even the quality of bread baked for tenants or travelers carries significance. It reflects the competence of the abbess and the convent's ability to fulfill obligations beyond the cloister. These mundane tasks, when executed properly, reinforce authority and communal stability. Education, too, is practical and essential. Novices learn to read and write for estate management, to calculate tithes and rents, and to maintain records. They acquire knowledge of agriculture, food preservation, and medicine. Oral instruction complements written records, ensuring continuity in skills and knowledge. In politically engaged houses, literacy and practical knowledge are not optional. They are essential for survival, governance, and maintaining legitimacy with external authorities. Environmental and logistical knowledge is critical. Sisters understand seasonal weather patterns, soil conditions, crop rotations, and water management. They monitor rivers, wells, and cisterns to ensure reliable water supply. Tools, buildings, and livestock are inspected and maintained to prevent failure. This accumulated expertise, often passed down orally, represents a repository of practical knowledge that allows the convent to endure environmental challenges year after year. Political awareness and diplomacy remain constant. The abbess must monitor local developments, respond to requests or complaints from tenants, and ensure compliance with legal obligations. She must navigate rival claims, taxation disputes, and expectations from patrons. Even routine work within the convent, such as supervising labor or distributing food, carries political weight. Negligence can be interpreted as incompetence, inefficiency, or disloyalty. The social dynamics of the house reinforce resilience. Novices learn from experienced sisters, observing both spiritual discipline and practical governance. Cooperation is essential. Success or failure is communal, and mistakes are corrected collectively. The abbess mediates disputes, delegates labor, and ensures that both physical work and spiritual duties are maintained. The hierarchy, though structured by rule, functions pragmatically. Authority is exercised to ensure survival, continuity, and observance of both spiritual and temporal obligations. Even in these politically engaged houses, silence, ritual, and communal prayer provide psychological stability. Canonical hours structure the day, offering moments of reflection, cohesion, and renewal. These practices maintain spiritual discipline amidst the pressures of labor, governance, and crisis. The blending of spiritual and practical responsibilities defines daily life. Success is measured not only in material terms, but also in the faithful observance of communal rhythm. And so, as the convent enters the long nights of autumn, with harvested grain stored and winter preparations underway, one unresolved question remains. When balancing spiritual devotion, estate management, and political negotiation, what ultimately sustains the abbess and her community, the discipline of prayer, the skill of governance, or the solidarity of sisters navigating shared responsibility under constant pressure? As winter approaches, convents in politically active regions face a convergence of pressures, environmental, social, and political. For an abbess, the onset of snow does not signal rest. Rather, it heightens both responsibility and vigilance. Roads become treacherous, communication slows, and estates must be carefully managed to ensure supplies and security throughout the harsh months ahead. In this environment, the ordinary rhythms of prayer, labor, and administration are amplified by necessity, testing both skill and endurance. Environmental crises remain ever present. Early snowfalls can disrupt travel to and from estate holdings, preventing inspections of fields, mills, and granaries. Freezing temperatures threaten livestock and stored crops. Wells may freeze, making water collection arduous. Sisters must anticipate these hazards, hauling firewood, reinforcing shelters, and preparing emergency rations. Knowledge of the local landscape, forests, rivers, hills, is essential, as is understanding seasonal patterns. Mistakes in preparation carry consequences that ripple through both the spiritual and material life of the convent. Disease adds another layer of complexity. Cold, damp conditions encourage respiratory infections and outbreaks of fevers. Food scarcity during long winters can weaken immunity. Abbesses and senior sisters oversee isolation for the sick, preparation of herbal remedies, and rationing to maintain health across the community. Illness also affects labor. Fields remain untended, animals require care, and estate administration may falter. Crisis management, therefore, integrates both practical and spiritual attention. Political challenges intensify in winter. Lords and local authorities may demand payments, enforce legal claims, or test the abbess's authority. Even minor disputes over land boundaries or tithes can escalate in the absence of clear oversight. Letters, petitions, and charters document these negotiations, requests for delay, appeals for exemptions, or formal assertions of rights. The abbess must balance diplomacy with firmness, protecting both the convent's material resources and the community's spiritual autonomy. Within the convent, social dynamics respond to these pressures. Sisters coordinate labor meticulously, cutting and storing firewood, feeding livestock, preserving vegetables, and repairing buildings. Novices learn quickly that diligence is essential. A neglected task can affect both food supply and communal stability. Cooperation and obedience are reinforced through shared effort, while leadership by the abbess ensures order. Disputes over work assignments, food distribution, or dormitory arrangements must be mediated carefully to avoid undermining solidarity during times of scarcity. Food management is critical. Stored grain, preserved vegetables, and animal products must last for months. Sisters plan rations meticulously, adjusting portions based on availability and anticipated needs. Meal preparation, though repetitive, carries both practical and symbolic weight. Sustenance for the body supports sustained devotion, labor, and oversight. Even in abundance, rationing teaches discipline, fostering mindfulness of resources that underpins both spiritual and material stability. Labor and administration intertwine. Sisters must maintain records of income, expenses, rents, and harvests. Account books track payments, obligations, and distributions. Novices assist in copying ledgers, preparing petitions, or monitoring stockpiles. Administrative skill becomes a survival tool. Accurate documentation legitimizes claims, protects assets, and ensures continuity in governance. In politically active houses, literacy and numeracy are not optional. They are as essential as tending livestock or chopping firewood. Liturgical life continues in parallel. Canonical hours punctuate the day, providing structure amidst the pressures of winter and political uncertainty. Prayer reinforces communal cohesion, offers psychological stability, and maintains the spiritual mission of the convent. Even when fatigue or scarcity weighs heavily, ritual practice sustains both discipline and identity, reminding sisters that labor and governance are inseparable from devotion. Crisis response often requires improvisation. If a storm blocks access to a distant estate, sisters may need to repair fences, reinforce granaries, or redistribute food to cover shortfalls. If tenants fail to deliver rent or crops due to inclement weather, abbesses must negotiate compensation or appeal to local authorities. Even small decisions, delaying a feast day, adjusting work schedules, or reallocating tasks, carry significant implications for both morale and survival. The interplay of environmental, social, and political pressures requires constant vigilance and adaptive leadership. Training and education reinforce resilience. Novices learn practical skills under pressure, managing resources, supervising labor, tending animals, and preserving food. They also acquire literacy sufficient for estate administration, record-keeping, and correspondence. Instruction blends observation, demonstration, and participation, ensuring continuity of knowledge. In politically engaged houses, these competencies safeguard both material survival and spiritual continuity, shaping women capable of navigating complex medieval networks. External pressures highlight the interconnectedness of convents and broader society. Legal disputes, taxation demands, and military obligations create interdependencies with secular authorities. Negotiation and diplomacy protect both property and spiritual mission. Even isolated events, such as a nearby skirmish, flood, or plague outbreak, require adaptive strategies, demonstrating that no convent, however cloistered, operates entirely outside the wider political and environmental landscape. The psychological dimension is equally critical. Winter isolation, labor intensity, and political tension amplify stress. Communal prayer, shared meals, and structured labor provide support. Yet the abbess's leadership anchors the house. Decisions about rationing, labor allocation, and crisis response must balance fairness, efficiency, and spiritual guidance. Sisters rely on both discipline and solidarity to endure, reinforcing the delicate equilibrium of survival, governance, and devotion. Even routine labor carries political significance. Successful management of grain, livestock, and tenants signals competence to external authorities. Inefficiency or negligence can undermine credibility, provoke disputes, or invite external intervention. The abbess's oversight, coupled with the disciplined labor of sisters, ensures both practical and reputational survival. Every action, whether preserving vegetables, maintaining buildings, or writing letters, contributes to the stability of the community. Cultural and historical records reveal the sophistication of these houses. Ledgers, petitions, correspondence, and visitation reports illustrate careful attention to both spiritual and secular responsibilities. They document the intricate balance of labor, ritual, education, and administration required to sustain convents in contested regions. The cumulative impact of these activities shaped both local economies and spiritual life, leaving subtle but enduring traces in the historical record. Yet, despite careful planning, crises always leave questions unresolved. Winter, political tension, and environmental unpredictability create uncertainty. Even the most skilled abbess cannot fully control every variable. Storms, illness, disputes, or unforeseen obligations can disrupt carefully laid plans. Sisters must adapt, negotiate, and persevere. The delicate balance between spiritual devotion and worldly responsibility defines the daily experience, leaving both historians and contemporaries to wonder about the human costs and the quiet triumphs of such lives. As the convent prepares for another long winter, one question hangs in the cold air. When navigating overlapping pressures of governance, labor, environmental risk, and spiritual discipline, what ultimately sustains the community? The authority and skill of the abbess, the cohesion of sisters, or the shared rhythm of daily devotion that underpins survival in a precarious world? As winter deepens and the convent settles into the rhythm of long nights and short days, reflection becomes an essential part of life. The abbess and her sisters have navigated environmental hazards, political disputes, and the constant demands of labor and governance. While survival has required diligence and skill, reflection allows them to assess the outcomes of their efforts, the lessons learned, and the subtle but lasting influence of their work on both the physical and spiritual landscape surrounding the convent. Politically engaged convents, by their very nature, operate at the intersection of spiritual devotion and worldly responsibility. The abbess is not merely a spiritual guide, but also a steward of estates, a negotiator with secular authorities, and a custodian of resources. Historical records, charters, letters, account books demonstrate the precision, planning, and foresight required to fulfill these roles. The meticulous documentation of rents, tithes, labor obligations and disputes reflects an understanding of governance that is both practical and strategic, illustrating how these women shaped their communities far beyond the cloistered walls. Daily life, though often monotonous and physically demanding, reinforces this dual responsibility. Canonical hours structure the day, providing spiritual rhythm, while labor, harvesting, preserving, tending animals, maintaining buildings, sustains both the convent and its estates. Each task is intertwined with broader obligations, ensuring sufficient food for sisters, satisfying legal obligations to tenants and patrons, and maintaining reputation and authority in the region. Even the most repetitive chores carry layers of significance, demonstrating how ordinary acts of work contribute to extraordinary outcomes in survival and governance. Education and knowledge play a central role in the convent's endurance. No. Vices learn to read, write, and calculate, acquiring skills essential for estate management, record-keeping, and correspondence. They also learn practical skills, tending crops, preserving food, caring for animals, and preparing basic remedies. This dual focus ensures continuity of both spiritual and practical knowledge. The integration of literacy and hands-on experience prepares sisters to assume greater responsibility as they progress, sustaining the convent across generations and allowing for adaptability in times of crisis. Environmental awareness remains critical. Sisters understand seasonal patterns, soil conditions, water management, and livestock needs. They monitor weather and respond to natural threats, storms, frost, drought, or flooding. This knowledge is passed down through demonstration, oral instruction, and careful observation, forming a repository of expertise that is both practical and essential for survival. The convent functions as a microcosm where the natural world, spiritual life, and social obligations intersect, requiring constant vigilance and adaptability. Crisis management underscores the complexity of these houses. Environmental hazards, disease, or political pressure demand both foresight and improvisation. Abbesses must make decisions balancing spiritual care, labor allocation, and estate management. Sisters must adapt to shortages, maintain communal discipline, and support one another. These crises reveal not only vulnerability, but also resilience, demonstrating the capacity of convents to endure through foresight, cooperation, and skillful administration. Social dynamics within the convent reinforce resilience. The abbess provides leadership and mediates disputes, while novices learn both obedience and initiative. Cooperation is essential, as each member contributes to communal survival. Even minor errors, mismanaged rations, overlooked maintenance, delayed correspondence, can have ripple effects. Through structured labor, communal prayer, and shared responsibility, sisters create a stable environment that integrates spiritual devotion with practical governance, allowing the house to function efficiently even under pressure. Political awareness and diplomacy are central to survival. Abbesses navigate legal obligations, disputes with neighbors, taxation, and expectations from patrons. They correspond with local authorities, bishops, and lords, advocating for protection or concessions when necessary. Even routine labor, maintaining mills, managing granaries, supervising tenants, has political implications, signaling competence, reliability, and authority. The convent's success is inseparable from its ability to balance internal cohesion with external relationships. Food and resource management remain both practical and symbolic. Grain, preserved vegetables, and animal products sustain sisters and support estate obligations. Planning, rationing, and preservation demonstrate foresight and discipline. The act of preparing meals, though repetitive, is also a visible manifestation of the abbess's authority and the community's cohesion. Survival depends not only on physical resources, but also on the effective management of labor, skills, and collective effort. Spiritual practice continues to anchor the community. Canonical hours, ritual observances, and seasonal celebrations provide structure, cohesion, and psychological relief. Prayer offers stability in the face of uncertainty, reinforcing the communal identity and ethical flows. Aim work that guides labor, governance, and interaction with the wider world. Even during crises, devotion sustains both moral and practical resilience, intertwining spiritual purpose with the demands of worldly management. Historical evidence shows that politically engaged convents were not passive participants in medieval society, but active agents shaping both local economies and spiritual life. Their labor, literacy, diplomacy, and governance had tangible impacts. Estates remained productive, tenants managed, legal claims defended, and spiritual obligations fulfilled. Even in isolation, convents influenced social, economic, and religious networks, leaving a subtle but enduring mark that historians can trace through surviving manuscripts, account books, and correspondence. Reflecting on the balance of responsibilities reveals profound insights. Survival required practical skill, environmental awareness, and careful management of resources. Governance demanded literacy, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. Spiritual devotion provided structure, moral grounding, and psychological support. The convent's strength lay not in any single aspect, but in the integration of these elements, the alignment of labor, prayer, governance, and solidarity within a disciplined communal framework. Even seemingly mundane tasks, sweeping floors, feeding livestock, copying ledgers, contributed to continuity, legitimacy, and resilience. Physical labor reinforced spiritual discipline. Meticulous records ensured authority. Cooperative effort maintained cohesion. The convent was a living system, a network of responsibilities, relationships, and knowledge. Each sister, through her labor and devotion, played a role in sustaining the community and shaping its legacy. Legacy extends beyond survival. Politically engaged convents influenced land management, legal precedent, and local economies. They preserved knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and administration. Manuscripts, charters, and correspondence reveal sophisticated networks of communication and governance. These houses demonstrate the agency of medieval women, illustrating how discipline, skill, and devotion translated into both spiritual and worldly influence, even under conditions of isolation, environmental risk, and political pressure. Ultimately, the story of politically engaged convents underscores the integration of human ingenuity, devotion, and resilience. Sisters navigated multiple pressures: environmental, social, economic, and spiritual. They maintained discipline, observed ritual, and executed labor with precision, ensuring both survival and authority. The abbess guided, mediated, and planned, while novices learned, laborers executed tasks, and all maintained communal cohesion. This interplay of factors created enduring structures of knowledge, governance, and spirituality. The reflection is clear. The survival and influence of politically engaged convents depended on the integration of spiritual discipline, practical skill, administrative competence, and communal solidarity, a legacy that highlights the quiet but transformative impact of ordinary lives operating at the intersection of devotion and worldly responsibility.